The first thing Walter Bennett noticed wasn't the silence. It was how quickly his son stopped pretending. The moving van sat in the driveway under a pale Texas sky. Boxes were stacked neatly on the porch. A single suitcase rested beside the front door, packed with clothes Walter hadn't chosen. His old leather hat was lying on top, as if someone had remembered at the last second that a rancher ought to have a hat. Walter stood on the porch with one hand resting on the weathered railing. 72 years. 72 years of waking before sunrise. 72 years of fixing fences, pulling calves, repairing tractors, and watching storms roll across the Bennett ranch. Now he was leaving with one suitcase. David checked his watch. "Dad, we really need to get going." Walter looked across the pasture where a small herd grazed lazily. "I remember when there wasn't a fence out there." David sighed. "Dade, you boys built that west fence with me." Mark laughed under his breath. "I barely remember that." Walter smiled faintly. "I do." Ryan shifted awkwardly beside the truck. "Dad, it's just, this is better for you." Walter nodded once. "Is it?" Nobody answered. Instead, David reached for Walter's arm. "We've talked about this." "We have." "You agreed." Walter looked at him for several seconds. "I agreed because the three of you already made the decision." David avoided his eyes. "It wasn't easy." Walter almost believed he meant it. Almost. The Bennett Ranch stretched over nearly 4,000 acres. Rolling fields, oak trees older than anyone alive, a creek that never completely dried, the red barn Walter's grandfather built by hand. Everything held a memory. Margaret planting wildflowers near the mailbox, the boys racing horses through the south pasture, summer cookouts, Christmas bonfires, birthdays, funerals. Life. Walter wasn't leaving a house. He was leaving every chapter of his life. The nursing home was 90 minutes away. No one spoke much during the drive. Country music played softly on the radio until Mark turned it off. Ryan tried making small talk. "They've got activities there." Walter looked out the window. "I'm sure they do." "A fishing pond." "That's nice. And card games." Walter smiled politely. "I've never been much of a card player." Silence returned. David finally cleared his throat. Walter turned slowly. "When?" David blinked. "What? When will you visit?" David hesitated. "We're busy with the ranch." "I know. But we'll come." Walter nodded. "I hope so." He didn't ask again, he already knew. Sunrise Haven Senior Living looked more like a hotel than a nursing home. Fresh flowers, brick walkways, rocking chairs, friendly smiles. Everything looked pleasant. Almost too pleasant. A cheerful receptionist welcomed them. "You must be Mr. Bennett." Walter tipped his hat. "Morning. My name is Linda. We're happy you're here." Walter forced a smile. "I'm still deciding how happy I am." She laughed gently. "I hear that a lot." She wasn't offended. Walter appreciated that. A nurse named Carla arrived with paperwork. David immediately stepped forward. "I've already filled everything out." Walter noticed. Every answer came from David. Every signature line was already marked. Every decision had already been made. Carla finally looked at Walter. "Any questions?" Walter looked around the lobby. "Just one." "Of course." "How long does it usually take before a place starts feeling like home?" Carla paused, long enough to answer honestly. "Depends who's waiting for you." Walter nodded slowly. "I figured as much." His room overlooked a small garden. There were birds, a bench, a fountain. Someone had placed a quilt across the bed. It was nice. Too nice. Because none of it belonged to him. Ryan carried in the suitcase. "I'll put your things away." Walter shook his head. "I can manage." Ryan stood still. "Dad, I said I'll manage." Ryan quietly set the suitcase beside the closet. For a moment, Walter thought his youngest son might actually say something meaningful. Instead, "I've got to get back." Walter smiled. "I know." Ryan hugged him awkwardly. It lasted barely 2 seconds. Then he was gone. Mark followed. David stayed behind. "I know you're angry." Walter looked out the window. "No." David frowned. "No, I'm disappointed." There was a difference. David knew it. "I'm doing what's best." Walter finally turned. "For who?" David opened his mouth, closed it, then left without answering. Walter listened as their footsteps faded down the hallway. The front doors opened, closed. An engine started. Then another. A few moments later, nothing. They were gone. Walter sat on the edge of the bed for several minutes. No tears came. He'd buried his wife 4 years earlier. Those tears had already emptied something inside him. This felt different. Not grief. Abandonment. He opened the small suitcase. 5 shirts, 3 pairs of jeans, slippers, a toothbrush, his Bible, a framed photograph. Margaret, she stood beside him in front of the old red barn. Her smile hadn't changed in 40 years. Walter ran his thumb gently across the glass. "You warned me." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Margaret used to say the ranch wasn't the hardest thing to protect. family was. At the time, he'd laughed. Now he understood. A knock came at the door. A woman in her early 40s stepped inside wearing navy blue scrubs, dark blonde hair tied back, kind eyes. No fake smile. Mr. Bennett? That's me. I'm Emily Carter. I'm one of the physical therapists. Walter stood. Nice to meet you. She noticed immediately. You move pretty well. I've walked a ranch most of my life. She smiled. So I've heard. Walter chuckled. Already got my file memorized. Only enough to know everyone keeps calling you fragile. Walter raised an eyebrow. And, you don't look fragile? I appreciate that. She looked around the room, settling in. I'm trying? You don't have to like today. Walter looked surprised. What? Everyone keeps telling new residents they'll love it here. She shrugged. I think that's unfair. Walter couldn't help smiling. You do. I think today is probably awful. He laughed. The first genuine laugh all day. Emily smiled. There he is. What? The man everyone says has a stubborn streak. Walter grinned. I've been called worse. I'm sure. She handed him tomorrow's therapy schedule. We'll take things one day at a time. Walter nodded. One day's about all I can handle. Before leaving, Emily stopped at the doorway. Oh, one more thing. Yes. Nobody loses who they are just because they move into this building. Walter looked at her for a long moment, then simply said, Thank you. She nodded once and disappeared down the hallway. That evening, Walter wandered slowly through the courtyard. Residents sat quietly under the fading sunset. Some watched birds. Some stared into space. Some waited. For visitors. For phone calls. For tomorrow. An elderly man waved him over. First day, Walter nodded. Shows. The man smiled sadly. Always. They introduced themselves. His name was Frank. Former mechanic, 3 daughters. None lived nearby anymore. They call? Sometimes. They visit. Frank looked toward the parking lot. When they're already in town, Walter understood. No further explanation needed. Night settled over Sunrise and Walter lay awake staring at the ceiling. Every unfamiliar sound reminded him he wasn't home. No coyotes. No windmill creaking. No cattle shifting outside the bedroom window. Just distant televisions. Footsteps. Doors opening and closing. He reached for Margaret's photograph again. You always knew people better than I did. He smiled sadly. I kept thinking they'd remember what this place means. His eyes closed for a moment. They forgot. Then another thought crossed his mind. One Margaret had insisted on years ago. The ranch paperwork. He had never changed it. Not after the arguments. Not after the pressure. Not after the promises. He still remembered exactly where every original document was kept. Walter opened his eyes. For the first time since arriving, he didn't feel helpless. His sons believed they had already won. They believed the ranch was finally theirs. They believed the old man was out of the way. Walter wasn't interested in revenge, but he had made one promise to Margaret. Protect the ranch until the right hands are ready. He had every intention of keeping it. And before this was over, his sons were going to learn something they should have asked years ago. Who really owned Bennett Ranch? If you've ever seen a family torn apart by greed, or watched someone underestimate the quiet strength of an older generation, let us know in the comments below. Your stories often remind others they aren't alone. And if you enjoy heartfelt family dramas with powerful twists, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. Outside, the Texas wind carried across the fields Walter could no longer see. Somewhere beyond the darkness, a storm was beginning to build. Walter Bennett had always believed mornings told the truth. On the ranch, Sunrise didn't care if you were rich or poor. The cattle still needed feeding. Fences still needed checking. Rain still came when it wanted. At Sunrise Haven, mornings were different. Lights flicked on at 6. Breakfast trays rolled down the hallway. Televisions filled the silence before people did. Walter lay awake long before anyone knocked on his door. He had barely slept. Not because the bed was uncomfortable. Because every few minutes he caught himself listening for sounds that weren't there. The distant rumble of his old pickup. The rooster crowing behind the barn. The screen door slamming as Margaret walked onto the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. Instead, there was only the steady hum of an air conditioner. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Bennett. Come in. Carla stepped inside with a warm smile. Good morning. It is. She laughed. Well, it's morning. I suppose that's true. She handed him a small tablet. Breakfast starts in 30 minutes. Walter looked at the schedule. Breakfast, medication, physical therapy, lunch, activities, dinner, movie night. He frowned. Looks like someone planned every minute. Carla smiled. Some people like routines. Walter folded the paper carefully. I've lived by routines my whole life. She nodded. But I was the one making them. The dining room buzzed with quiet conversations. Some residents sat together every morning, others stared out the windows. Walter carried his tray toward an empty table. Before he could sit, someone called out, "Rancher." Walter turned. Frank waved him over. "We saved you a chair." Walter smiled. "Appreciate it." Frank introduced the others. Helen had spent 35 years teaching 3rd grade. George had served in the Marines before becoming a firefighter. Eleanor had owned a bakery with her husband until arthritis forced them to retire. Within 5 minutes, Walter realized something. Every person at the table had once lived a full, independent life. Yet every conversation eventually drifted toward the same subject: visitors. "My son said he'd come Sunday. My granddaughter's been busy. My daughter called last week. They mean well." Walter listened more than he spoke. The excuses sounded practiced, not because the families believed them, because the parents wanted to. Hope was easier than disappointment. Frank noticed Walter hadn't touched his eggs. "Not hungry?" Walter shrugged. "I've eaten breakfast at 5 every morning for 50 years. George grinned. "What you eat?" "Whatever Margaret put in front of me." The table chuckled. Helen smiled. "You miss her." Every day, no one tried to comfort him. They understood. Across town, David Bennett stood in the ranch office staring at a stack of papers. The developer's representative, Brent Lawson, leaned comfortably against the desk. Brent smiled. "Once your father settles in, we can move forward." David nodded. "He's not coming back." "You sure?" "He can barely get around." Brent slid another folder across the desk. "The investors are excited." David opened it. "Architect drawings, luxury homes, private lakes, a golf course." The words Bennett Ranch disappeared beneath glossy artist renderings. Brent pointed toward the largest drawing. "This alone triples the property's value." David stared at it. Nearly 200 years of family history, reduced to blueprints. "When can we announce?" David hesitated. "Soon." Brent smiled. "I'll start preparing the press conference." Mark pulled into the ranch a few minutes later. He looked exhausted. David noticed immediately. "You look terrible. Didn't sleep. You drinking again?" Mark ignored the question. "You got the money?" David shook his head. "Not until the sale." Mark rubbed his face. "I'd eat it sooner." David frowned. "How bad?" Mark didn't answer. That told David everything. "You gambled again." "I'm handling it." "Bull." Mark slammed the truck door. "I said I'm handling it." Neither brother noticed Ryan standing nearby. He had heard enough. Ryan walked toward the horse barn. His daughter Sophie was brushing an old chestnut mare. She looked up. Grandpa called. Ryan hesitated. "No. You going to visit him today?" "I've got work." "You said that yesterday." Ryan sighed. "Soph." He asked if we'd visit. Ryan looked away. "I know." She kept brushing the horse. "You know what?" He cried after Grandma died. Ryan nodded. "I remember. I never saw him cry before." Ryan swallowed. "He loved her." Sophie looked directly at her father. "I think he's crying again." Ryan couldn't answer. Back at Sunrise Haven, Emily found Walter standing alone in the courtyard. "You skipped bingo." Walter looked puzzled. "I've managed 72 years without bingo." She laughed. "Fair enough." He watched a pair of sparrows hopping around the flower beds. "They don't ask permission." Emily followed his gaze. "The birds. They just go where they want." She smiled. "I've never been jealous of sparrows before." Walter chuckled. "They've got freedom." Emily folded her arms. "You know what? I read your therapy report. That sounds dangerous. It says you should be using a walker." Walter frowned. "I don't like walkers." "Psst. I noticed. They make people looking at your face." Emily looked at him carefully. "What do they look at?" "The walker." She nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to say something similar." Walter smiled. "Smart woman." Emily leaned against the railing. "Would you make me a deal?" "Depends. Try the walker during therapy. And, if you still hate it after a week." She shrugged. "We'll argue about it." Walter laughed again. "You negotiate." "My lawyer says I do." Walter blinked. "Lawyer, my ex-husband." There was no bitterness in her voice, only acceptance. Walter nodded. "Guess he lost." Womley laughed. "I like you already?" Therapy proved harder than Walter expected. Not because his body couldn't move, because his pride resisted every exercise. Emily noticed. "You don't have to prove anything. I've spent my whole life proving things." "To who?" Walter stopped walking. He hadn't thought about that in years. "My father?" Emily waited. "He died 20 years ago." She smiled gently. "And you're still trying." Walter looked out the window. Maybe she was right. That afternoon, Walter wandered into the small library. A bookshelf stood in the corner beside an old fireplace. He ran his fingers along the worn bindings. History, westerns, biographies. A familiar voice interrupted him. "You actually read those?" Frank grinned. Walter pulled out a book about Texas ranching. I lived most of it. Frank smiled. Then maybe you should write one? Walter chuckled. I don't think anyone would believe it. Meanwhile, 2 counties away, Attorney Daniel Foster unlocked the door to his law office. Waiting on his desk sat an envelope marked only with 3 words. For Walter only. Daniel frowned. He recognized the handwriting immediately. Margaret Bennett. But Margaret had been gone for 4 years. He slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. If you're reading this, Walter finally decided it's time. Protect him. Protect the ranch. Don't let anyone pressure him into changing what we've built. He'll know what this means. Daniel leaned back in his chair. He remembered the meeting. Years ago, Margaret had insisted they leave certain documents exactly as they were, just in case. Daniel reached for his phone. He dialed Walter's number. Walter answered on the 3rd ring. Hello, Walter. Walter immediately recognized the voice. Daniel. I received something Margaret wanted me to open only if you ever left the ranch. Walter closed his eyes. So she planned for this. I believe she did. There was a long silence. Finally Daniel spoke again. Do you want me to come see you? Walter looked out toward the garden where residents sat quietly beneath the afternoon sun. Yes. When? As soon as possible. Daniel lowered his voice. Has something happened? Walter thought carefully before answering. Not yet. Another pause, but I believe it's about to. I'll be there tomorrow. Walter ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. For the first time since arriving at Sunrise Haven, he wasn't simply reacting, he was preparing. Miles away, David Bennett stood in front of reporters giving a confident interview about the exciting future of the Bennett property. Behind the cameras, Brent Lawson smiled. Neither man noticed that they were celebrating a deal that legally didn't belong to them. And by this time tomorrow, Walter Bennett's oldest friend would arrive carrying documents capable of changing every one of their plans. Walter was already dressed when the sun rose. Old habits refused to die. His jeans were pressed. His boots were polished. His hat rested neatly on the chair beside the window. He looked outside. The garden was covered in dew. For a brief moment, he imagined he was looking across the pasture back home. Then the automatic doors hissed open downstairs. Reality returned. Emily found him sitting on a bench outside. You've been up a while. Walter smiled. I've already been awake 3 hours. You sleep any better? Not really. She sat beside him. My dad was the same after he retired. Walter looked at her. He a rancher? No. What did he do? He built houses? Walter nodded. Hard to stop building? Emily smiled sadly. He never really did. Walter looked at his hands. I think that's the problem. What is? They took away my work. Bushy waited. They think they took away my purpose. Back at the ranch, Ryan walked into the equipment shed. The old John Deere tractor sat exactly where Walter had parked it before leaving. The ignition key was still hanging from its familiar hook. Ryan ran his hand along the faded green paint. His father always said a tractor told you everything about its owner. Keep it clean. Fix problems early. Never ask it to do something you wouldn't do yourself. Ryan climbed into the seat. It didn't feel right. He climbed back down. David was in the office reviewing numbers. Brent Lawson spread several maps across the desk. The survey team wants access next week. David nodded. They can start with the Northfields. Ryan stepped inside. The Northfields? David barely looked up. Surveyors. For what? Brent answered before David could. Future development. We haven't voted. David laughed. Vote. This isn't a city council. It's our ranch. David finally looked at him. No. He tapped the desk. It's our future. Ryan crossed his arms. What if Dad says no? David smiled. He won't. You talk to him. I don't need to. Ryan didn't argue. But something about his brother's confidence unsettled him. At Sunrise Haven, Daniel Foster arrived carrying a worn leather briefcase. Walter recognized him immediately. The 2 men embraced without saying a word. Daniel stepped back. You've lost weight. Walter chuckled. You always did know how to flatter a man. Daniel looked around the courtyard. I hate seeing you here. So do I. They sat beneath a large oak tree. Daniel opened the briefcase. I brought everything. Walter took a slow breath. The originals? Daniel nodded. Exactly where Margaret wanted them. One by one he placed folders on the table. Property deed, trust documents, tax records, water rights, mineral rights. Walter looked at the familiar signatures. Margaret's handwriting appeared on several pages. His eyes lingered there. Daniel spoke quietly. She insisted we keep ownership exactly as it was. Walter smiled faintly. I remember arguing with her. Daniel laughed. You lost. I usually did. Daniel became serious. Your sons have never owned the ranch. I know. They've managed it. Walter nodded. But legally, Daniel placed one document in front of him. The Bennett Ranch belongs entirely to Walter James Bennett. Walter stared at the paper. Not because he doubted it, because seeing it made everything real. Daniel continued. They cannot sell it. Walter remained silent. They cannot mortgage it. Still nothing. They cannot transfer ownership. Finally, Walter spoke. I was hoping they'd remember why I never signed it over. Daniel looked at him. They assumed. Walter sighed. They stopped asking questions years ago. Emily approached cautiously. I don't want to interrupt. Walter smiled. Emily, this is Daniel Foster. Daniel stood. Pleased to meet you. You too. Emily noticed the stack of documents. I'll leave you two alone. Walter stopped her. It's all right. She hesitated. Walter looked at Daniel. I trust her. Daniel smiled. Margaret always had good instincts about people. Emily sat down. I don't need to know details. Walter nodded. But I can tell something important is happening. Daniel closed one folder. Mr. Bennett owns considerably more than most people realize. Emily looked at Walter. You never mentioned that. Walter shrugged. It never seemed important. She smiled. I have a feeling it soon will be. Daniel leaned closer. There's something else. Walter looked up. I checked county filings before driving here. Walter frowned. What did you find? Daniel pulled another document from the briefcase. Someone requested zoning information on your property. Walter didn't look surprised. Developer. Daniel nodded. Looks that way. When? 3 weeks ago. Walter looked toward the flower garden. So this started before they brought me here. Daniel answered quietly. I believe so. Emily's expression changed. They planned this. Walter gave a slow nod. I think they planned more than they're admitting. Across town, Mark sat inside a smoky poker room. His hands trembled as he counted the cash left in his wallet. Not enough. Nowhere near enough. A heavy-set man approached. You got my money? Soon. You've been saying that. The ranch is selling. The man leaned closer. I don't own the ranch. Mark swallowed. My family does. The man smiled without humor. You'd better hope that's true. Back at Sunrise Haven, Walter walked Daniel toward the parking lot. You should have called sooner. Walter smiled. I kept believing they'd come around. And now? Walter watched the traffic passing outside. Now I think they believe I'm gone. What do you want to do? Walter answered without hesitation. I want the truth. Revenge. Walter shook his head. No. Punishment. Again. No. Daniel looked surprised. Then what? Walter took a deep breath. I want my sons to tell the truth. Daniel smiled. You know that's harder. I do, boo. If they can't, Walter looked back toward the building. Then I'll protect the ranch myself. That evening Sophie arrived unexpectedly. She carried a small paper bag. The receptionist smiled. Mr. Bennett has a visitor. Walter looked up from his book. Sophie. She hugged him tightly, longer than anyone else had. I missed you. I missed you too, sweetheart. She handed him the bag. I brought pecan pie. Walter laughed. Your grandmother's recipe. She nodded proudly. I made it myself. Walter opened the container. It even smells like hers. Sophie smiled. I hoped it would. They sat together in the courtyard sharing pie with 2 plastic forks. For the first time since arriving, Walter felt a little less alone. Sophie finally asked the question no one else had. Grandpa? Yeah. Are you coming home? Walter looked at the fading sunset. I don't know. She lowered her eyes. I don't think the ranch feels like home without you. Walter reached across the table and squeezed her hand. It isn't the buildings that make a place home. What is? The people? She thought about that. What if the people forget? Walter looked toward the horizon. Then someone has to remind them. As Sophie left, Walter noticed David's pickup parked across the street. It pulled away the moment she climbed into her car. He hadn't come to visit. He'd come to watch. Walter's eyes narrowed. The game had already begun, and now he knew his oldest son was worried enough to keep an eye on him. Walter had spent most of his life reading things other people missed. A broken fence post, fresh tire tracks. The way cattle move before a storm. He learned early that if you paid attention, people weren't much different. David hadn't parked across the street by accident. He was watching. The question was, why? The next morning, Walter was finishing breakfast when Frank slid into the chair beside him. You look different. Walter smiled. Do I? You've got that look. What look? The one people get when they've stopped feeling sorry for themselves. Walter chuckled. I was feeling sorry for myself. A little. Walter stirred his coffee. Maybe. And now? Walter looked toward the window. Now I've got something to do. Frank grinned. I figured. Emily found Walter in the therapy room before their appointment. "You're early. I've always believed if you're on time, you're late," she laughed. "That sounds exhausting. It keeps a ranch running." She handed him a resistance band. "We're going to work on balance today." Walter sighed dramatically. "I was hoping you'd changed your mind." "No chance." As they worked through the exercises, Emily noticed something. "You seem happier." "Happier isn't the word." "What is?" "Focused." She nodded. "I like focused better." Walter carefully stepped over a row of cones. Emily watched without interrupting. "What?" "I've been thinking about what you said." "When?" "The day I arrived." She frowned. "I've said a lot of things. Nobody loses who they are just because they move into this building." Emily smiled. "I meant it." Walter nodded. "I think I finally believe it." Across town, David stood in the county planning office. Brent Lawson shook hands with a zoning official. Everything should move quickly. The official looked through several folders. "As long as ownership documentation is complete." David answered confidently. "It will be. When should we expect it?" "Soon." The official smiled. "We'll need the owner's signature before anything moves forward." David forced a smile. "Of course." As they walked back to the parking lot, Brent lowered his voice. "How long before your father signs?" David hesitated. "He trusts me." Brent studied him. "That's not what I asked." David climbed into his truck. "I'll handle it." But for the first time, he didn't sound certain. Ryan was repairing a section of fence when Sophie rode up on horseback. "You skipped school." She rolled her eyes. "It's Saturday." Ryan laughed. "I knew that." "No, you didn't." She climbed on the horse. "I saw Grandpa yesterday." Ryan kept hammering. "How's he doing?" "He misses home." Ryan nodded slowly. "I figured." He asked about the horses. Ryan smiled. "That sounds like Grandpa." He asked if Daisy was still limping. Ryan stopped hammering. "How'd he know that?" "I don't know." Ryan stared toward the pasture. Daisy had started limping 2 days after Walter left. No one had mentioned it. Somehow Walter had guessed. Sophie smiled. "He still knows this place." Ryan whispered more to himself than to her. "Maybe better than we do." Mark's phone rang just after noon. He looked at the screen. "Unknown number." He answered anyway. "Yeah, you've got 48-hour froze." I said I'm getting the money. "I know what you said." The line went quiet for a second. "But promises don't pay debts." The call ended. Mark stared at the phone. His hands were shaking. Back at Sunrise Haven, Walter spent the afternoon helping another resident fix a broken bird feeder. George watched from a nearby bench. "You know maintenance is supposed to do that." Walter tightened one final screw. They looked busy. George laughed. "You've been here 4 days. So, you've already fixed 3 things." Walter shrugged. "I don't sit well." George nodded knowingly. "None of us did." Walter looked around the courtyard. "When did you stop trying?" George didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, "The day I started believing everyone else." Walter frowned. "What they tell you." "That my useful years were behind me." Walter sat beside him. "And were they?" George smiled. "No." "What happened?" "I just forgot." Walter looked around the courtyard again. Maybe that was the saddest thing about places like Sunrise Haven. Not that people grew old, that they slowly accepted becoming invisible. Emily walked outside carrying 2 bottles of water. She handed one to Walter. "Thanks. You've been busy." "So I've been told." She glanced toward the repaired bird feeder. "I heard about that." Walter smiled. "Couldn't leave it broken, you know." She sat beside him. "People notice when you help." Walter shrugged. "I've always believed everybody should leave a place a little better than they found it." Emily smiled. "Your wife teach you that?" Walter laughed softly. "No point. I thought she'd get the credit. Margaret taught me plenty." He looked down at the water bottle. "But that lesson came from my father." Emily waited. "He used to say." Walter smiled at the memory. "If your hands still work, someone probably needs them." Emily nodded. "He sounds like a good man. He wasn't perfect." "No. He had a temper." "So do you." Walter laughed. "I suppose I do. But he showed up." Emily noticed the change in his expression. "You miss your sons?" Walter looked away. "I miss who they used to be." That evening, Daniel Foster called again. "I've been digging." Walter closed the book he was reading. "What'd you find?" "Your oldest son formed a new company 6 months ago." Walter frowned. "What kind of company?" "Real estate investment." Walter didn't speak. Daniel continued. "It has one listed partner." "Ooh, Brent Lawson." Walter leaned back slowly. "So they're already in business together." "It appears that way." Walter closed his eyes. "Anything else?" Daniel hesitated. "There are emails." Walter opened his eyes again. "What emails?" "I can't access them legally." But I know someone who can subpoena them if necessary. Walter nodded. Not yet. You sure? I want to see how far they're willing to go. Daniel sighed. I've known you 40 years. And you're setting a trap. Walter smiled faintly. No. What then? I'm giving them every chance to tell the truth. The annual Bennett Ranch Heritage Festival was less than 3 weeks away. For decades, it had been the biggest event in the county. Families came from neighboring towns. Children rode horses. Old ranchers swapped stories. The local high school band played in front of the Red Barn. It wasn't just a festival. It was a tradition. This year, David had something different planned. He stood in front of a large banner inside the barn. Welcome to the future of Bennett Ranch. Brent nodded approvingly. The announcement will get plenty of attention. David smiled. Everyone will be there. Your father. David shook his head. He won't even know it's happening. Outside the barn, Ryan overheard the conversation. His stomach tightened. His father had built that festival with Margaret nearly 30 years earlier. They had started it as a thank you to the community that supported the ranch through a devastating drought. Now, David wanted to use it to announce the end of everything it stood for. Ryan looked toward the old farmhouse. For the first time in his life, he wondered if his oldest brother had gone too far. Miles away, Walter stood by the window of his room, watching rain begin to fall over the nursing home's garden. He couldn't explain why, but deep inside, he suddenly felt like the ranch needed him more than ever. Rain had followed Walter most of his life, not because he chased storms, because ranchers learned to pay attention to them. Some storms watered your fields, others washed them away. The trick was knowing the difference. As rain tapped gently against the window of Sunrise Haven, Walter stood with a cup of coffee, staring into the gray morning. He wasn't thinking about the weather. He was thinking about his sons. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped noticing the storm that had been growing inside his own family. Emily found him in the hallway. Coffee before breakfast. Walter smiled. Always. I thought ranchers drank it black. We do. She looked into his mug. Cream. Walter shrugged. My wife started sneaking cream into it about 20 years ago. Emily laughed. You noticed? Not at first. So why keep drinking it that way? Walter smiled at the memory. Because it tastes like Margaret. Emily didn't say anything. Some memories didn't need advice. They just needed room to breathe. After therapy, Walter wandered into the recreation room. A handful of residents were putting together a large jigsaw puzzle. Helen looked up. We need another pair of eyes. Walter studied the table. Looks like you need 3. George chuckled. That's exactly what Frank said. Walter pulled up a chair. For nearly an hour, nobody talked about illnesses, or medications, or children who never visited. They talked about old cars, fishing trips, favorite diners that had disappeared years ago. Normal things. Walter realized something. These people hadn't lost themselves. They'd simply run out of people willing to remember who they used to be. Across town, Ryan stood in the horse barn brushing Daisy. The mare nudged his shoulder. You miss him too, don't you? She snorted softly. Ryan smiled. Yeah, so do I. His phone buzzed. It was David. Come to the office. Now, Ryan sighed. I guess that means we're done. He gave Daisy one last before heading toward the ranch office. Inside, David already looked irritated. Brent Lawson sat across from him with several folders spread across the desk. We've got a problem, David said. Ryan frowned. What kind? The county wants updated ownership paperwork before they'll schedule the public hearing. Ryan blinked. Isn't that normal? It is. So what's the problem? David hesitated. Some of the files are old. Ryan looked from David to Brent. What does that mean? Brent answered smoothly. It means we need your father's signature. Ryan felt something tighten in his chest. I thought you already had everything. David forced a smile. We're just updating records. Ryan wasn't convinced. What exactly are we asking him to sign? David's expression hardened. Don't start. I'm asking a question, and I'm telling you we'll handle it. Ryan folded his arms. No. David looked up. No. If Dad signs something... Ryan paused. I want to know exactly what it is. Silence filled the room. Brent quietly closed one of the folders. We'll discuss it later. Ryan walked out without another word. Behind him, Brent looked at David. Your brother's becoming a liability. David stared toward the door. I'll deal with him. Mark sat alone inside a small roadside bar. He hadn't ordered a drink. That surprised even the bartender. Instead, he kept staring at the balance on his phone. Negative again. His hands trembled. Another message appeared. 42 hours. Shriss. He shoved the phone into his pocket. A familiar voice interrupted him. You look like hell. Mark turned. It was an old friend, Jake Morrison. Former rodeo rider, now a truck driver. Jake slid into the booth. You all right? Mark laughed bitterly. Do I look all right? Jake didn't smile. For several moments, neither man spoke. Finally, Jake asked, You gambling again? Mark looked away. That was answer enough. Back at Sunrise Heaven, Daniel Foster arrived carrying another folder. Walter met him in the garden. You've been busy. Daniel nodded. So have your sons. He handed Walter several photocopies, corporate filings, bank records, meeting schedules. Walter looked carefully through each page. David never mentioned any of this. He wasn't planning to. Walter reached the final page. His expression changed. What is it? Daniel pointed toward a highlighted line. The developer has already scheduled a press conference. Walter frowned. When? 2 weeks. Walter looked up. Before the Heritage Festival. Daniel nodded. They're moving fast. Walter remained quiet. Much too quiet. Daniel recognized that look. You've got an idea. Walter smiled faintly. I have a question. What question? Why announce it before the festival? Daniel thought for a moment. Public support. Walter nodded. Exactly. He leaned back. They want everyone celebrating while they sell the place out from under them. Daniel smiled. You really do think like a rancher. Walter chuckled. Everything's about timing. Emily joined them after finishing with another patient. I hope I'm not interrupting. Walter shook his head. Not at all. She noticed the papers. You look serious. Walter handed her a photograph. It showed an artist's rendering of hundreds of expensive homes covering what had once been open pasture. Emily stared at it. This is my ranch. She looked up. They're replacing all of it. Walter nodded. The barn. The grazing fields. The creek. The orchard Margaret planted. Emily slowly handed the picture back. I'm sorry. Walter smiled gently. Don't be. She looked confused. They're making a mistake. Emily frowned. What do you mean? Walter carefully folded the papers. They've forgotten one very important thing. She smiled. The ownership. Walter nodded. And people who think they've already won. He looked toward the rain-soaked garden. Usually stop paying attention. That afternoon Sophie called. Grandpa. Hi, sweetheart. You busy? Just finished therapy. Wes what? What? Daisy isn't limping anymore. Walter smiled. I knew she'd be all right. You really did? There was a short pause. Then Sophie's voice became quieter. Dad and Uncle David have been arguing. Walter listened. They think I can't hear. But you can. Yeah. What are they arguing about? I don't know everything? She hesitated. But Uncle David kept saying, Dad doesn't need to know. Walter closed his eyes for a moment. I see. Grandpa. Yes. They're hiding something. Walter opened his eyes. I think you're right. That evening, David unlocked the old safe inside the ranch office. Most of the original family records had been moved years ago, or so he believed. He searched through yellowed folders, old insurance papers, tax receipts, livestock records, but one document was missing. The original property deed. He searched again, then a third time. Nothing. His breathing quickened. He picked up his phone and dialed Mark. Have you seen Dad's deed? No. Are you sure? I've never even looked for it. David ended the call and immediately dialed Ryan. Same answer. He slammed the safe door shut. For the first time since Walter had entered Sunrise Haven, David felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. Fear. Because if the original deed wasn't in the safe depth, there was only one person who might know exactly where it was. And that person had just started asking questions of his own. Walter had once told his sons that a ranch could survive almost anything. Drought, floods, harsh winters, falling cattle prices, even fire. But it'll never survive dishonesty, he'd said one evening around the dinner table. Once people stop trusting each other, the land becomes the least of your problems. Back then, the boys had nodded. They'd been teenagers. They thought he was talking about ranching. Now Walter realized he had been talking about family. He just hadn't known it yet. Monday mornings at Sunrise Haven followed a familiar rhythm. Breakfast, medication therapy, coffee. Walter was beginning to recognize faces before names. Mrs. Delgado liked crossword puzzles. George never missed the morning news. Frank complained about the coffee every single day but drank 2 cups anyway. Still terrible? Frank muttered after taking another sip. Walter grinned. You keep proving that by finishing it. Frank shrugged. I'm hopeful. Helen laughed. That's the nicest way I've ever heard someone describe stubbornness. Walter looked around the table. For the first time since arriving, breakfast didn't feel lonely. Emily found Walter in the workshop. It wasn't much. A small room with shelves of donated tools, birdhouses in various stages of completion, and a workbench scarred by decades of use. Walter was repairing a rocking chair. You asked permission first. He smiled. I did. And they were happy somebody knew how. Emily walked around the chair, inspecting his work. Looks better already. Walter tightened one final screw. Things usually can be fixed. She looked at him. You believe that? I have to. What if they don't want fixing? Walter stopped working. Then you fix what you can. Emily noticed the sadness behind his eyes. She understood he wasn't talking about furniture anymore. Across town, David sat across from Brent Lawson inside a private office overlooking downtown. Brent slid another contract across the table. The investors are asking questions. They'll get answers. They want a closing date. David rubbed his forehead. I'm working on it. Brent leaned back. How much does your father actually know? David answered too quickly. Nothing. You sure? He thinks he's retired. Brent studied him carefully. And if he isn't? David's jaw tightened. My father won't interfere. Brent didn't look convinced. I've done this a long time. So, the biggest deals don't usually fall apart because of strangers. He paused. They fall apart because families lie to each other. Ryan was feeding horses when Sophie walked into the barn carrying a notebook. What have you got there? She smiled. Grandpa's journal. Ryan frowned. I didn't know he kept one. I found it in the farmhouse. She opened it carefully. Most of the pages contained weather notes, calving records, rainfall totals, planning dates, but every few pages, there were handwritten memories. Ryan read one aloud. Today Sophie rode by herself for the first time. She was scared until she wasn't. Another entry. Margaret says the boys work too much and laugh too little. She's probably right. Ryan smiled despite himself. Then he reached another page. His smile disappeared. Never sign away something your grandchildren may someday need. Ryan closed the journal. Did Uncle David see this? Sophie shook her head. I don't think so. Let's keep it that way. Mark hadn't slept. Every sound outside his house made him jump. Every car slowing near the driveway made his heart race. His debt collector hadn't called again. That somehow made things worse. His phone buzzed. David, where are you? Home. Get to the ranch. Why? We've got another problem. Mark sighed. I'm coming. At sunrise having. Daniel Foster arrived carrying a long cardboard tube. Walter looked puzzled. Daniel smiled. I think you'll recognize it. He carefully removed an old survey map, the original Bennett Ranch boundary map, drawn by hand decades earlier. Walter carefully spread it across the table. His fingers traced familiar lines. The creek, the north pasture, the old oak where he'd proposed to Margaret. Daniel pointed toward a small handwritten note in the corner. You remember writing this? Walter smiled. I do. The note read, I land is borrowed from the next generation. Treat it that way. Emily had quietly walked up behind them. She read the word. That's beautiful. Walter shook his head. No. What? It's a responsibility. He looked at the map. I've spent my whole life believing I owned this ranch. He smiled sadly. The truth is, I was only taking care of it. Later that afternoon, Walter received another visitor, Ryan. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, hat twisting nervously in his hands. Walter looked genuinely surprised. You came? Ryan nodded. I said I would. Walter smiled gently. You also said yesterday? Ryan lowered his eyes. I know, for several seconds neither man spoke. Finally Ryan sat down. How are you? Walter chuckled. You drove 90 minutes to ask me that. Ryan smiled weakly. No. What'd you really come for? Ryan looked around to make sure they were alone. I think David's hiding something. Walter said nothing. I don't know exactly what. Walter still remained quiet, but it doesn't feel right. Finally Walter spoke. Why tell me? Ryan swallowed. Because what? He looked down at his boots. I'm starting to think sending you here wasn't really about your health. Walter studied his youngest son carefully. What do you think it was about? Ryan hesitated. The ranch. Walter nodded slowly. What changed your mind? Ryan took a deep breath. I found out they need your signature. Walter didn't react. Ryan noticed. You knew. I suspected. Ryan looked almost embarrassed. I'm sorry. For what? I should have asked more questions. Walter smiled sadly. You trusted your brothers. Ryan shook his head. No. He looked directly at his father. I stopped trusting myself. The words hung between them. Walter reached across the table. He placed a weathered hand over Ryan's. It takes courage to admit that. Ryan's eyes filled. I don't know how we got here. Walter answered quietly. It didn't happen all at once. Ryan nodded. I want to help. Walter squeezed his hand. Then start with one thing. What? Tell me the truth. Ryan looked relieved. I can do that? Before leaving, he stopped at the door. Dad? Yeah? I should have visited sooner. Walter smiled. I'm just glad you came. That evening, Ryan returned to the ranch with a weight lifted from his shoulders. It wasn't everything, But it was a beginning. As he parked near the barn, he noticed David and Brent standing beside a black SUV. They stopped talking the moment they saw him. David forced a smile. "How was your day?" Ryan looked him straight in the eye. "Productive." David watched his younger brother walk away. Something had changed. Ryan no longer looked uncertain. He looked determined. David turned to Brent. "I think he went to see Dad." Brent's expression hardened. "And?" David glanced toward the farmhouse. "I think we're running out of time." Neither of them noticed Sophie standing quietly in the hayloft above. She hadn't heard every word. Only one sentence. But it was enough. "I think he went to see Dad." She frowned. If visiting Grandpa made her father a problem, then maybe Grandpa wasn't the one who needed protecting anymore. Sophie barely moved until the black SUV disappeared down the long ranch driveway. The hayloft had always been her favorite place. As a little girl, she'd hide there while Walter pretended he couldn't find her. He always looked in the wrong places first. "The barn's too quiet," he'd call out with a grin. "Wes, there aren't any little girls hiding up here." She'd giggle every time. Now she stood in that same loft, only the laughter was gone. Her grandfather had taught her another lesson years ago. If people stop talking when you walk in, don't ask what they were saying. Why not? Because if it's important, he'd smiled, you'll figure it out another way. She thought about that as she climbed quietly down the ladder. Maybe it was time to start paying attention. The following morning, Walter stepped in the Sunrise Haven courtyard carrying a small toolbox. Frank looked up from his newspaper. "Planning to escape." Walter chuckled. "Just fixing a loose gate." George laughed. "Maintenance is going to start charging you rent." Walter knelt beside the gate. "It'll take 5 minutes." Emily walked outside just as he tightened the final bolt. "You really can't help yourself, can you?" Walter stood. "I slept better knowing it wouldn't swing open." Emily folded her arms. "You know what I've noticed?" "What?" "Every time you repair something." Walter waited. "The people around here start smiling." He looked around. She wasn't wrong. Residents had gathered nearby watching him work. Not because the gate mattered, because someone cared enough to fix it. Across town, David sat at the kitchen table inside the farmhouse. Spread before him were dozens of old family photographs. He wasn't looking for memories. He was looking for clues. Margaret had hidden important papers before. Sometimes inside books. Sometimes behind picture frames. She once tucked a property tax receipt inside an old recipe box because, as she'd said, no thief ever checks beside cookie recipes. David opened drawers, cabinets, closets, nothing. He muttered under his breath. Where did you put it? The original deed had vanished, and that terrified him more than he wanted to admit. Mark arrived an hour later. You wanted me? David didn't look up. Help me search. For what? Dade's deed. Mark frowned. I thought we already had copies. We do. So. I want the original. Mark shrugged. Why? David finally looked at him. Because I don't know who else has seen it. Mark leaned against the wall. You think Dad knows? David didn't answer. That was answer enough. Ryan spent the morning repairing a broken water pump near the south pasture. Sophie drove out on the ATV carrying 2 bottles of water. You've been out here all morning? Ryan smiled. So have you? She handed him a bottle. Can I ask you something? Sure. Are we selling the ranch? Ryan stared at the pump for several seconds before answering. I don't know. She frowned. You do know. He sighed. Some people want to. What about you? Ryan looked across the pasture. I used to think it made sense. And now, I don't know if money's worth losing everything. Sophie nodded slowly. Papa would say it isn't. Ryan smiled sadly. Yeah, he would. Back at Sunrise Haven, Walter and Daniel met again in the library. Daniel carried another folder. I found the loan records. Walter looked interested. What'd they borrow against? Daniel handed him several pages. Equipment, livestock, future projected income. Walter frowned. They borrowed against cattle that haven't even been sold yet. Daniel nodded. And new machinery. Walter shook his head. They never asked me. Daniel looked at him carefully. They didn't need your permission for operational loans. Walter sighed. I know. But they should have wanted my advice. Daniel smiled. You still think like a father. Walter looked down at the paperwork. I don't know how to stop. Emily walked in carrying 3 cups of coffee. I figured this meeting needed refreshments. Daniel laughed. You read people well, it's part of my job. She handed Walter his cup. No cream. Walter smiled. You remembered. Emily shrugged. I'm learning. Daniel watched the exchange. You've made quite an impression around here. Walter looked confused. Me. Emily smiled. The staff keeps talking about you. That's probably not good. Oh, it's good. Why? Yesterday Mrs. Simmons asked if you could fix her knitting basket. Walter laughed. I already did. And today Mr. Harris wants help repairing his radio. Walter looked at Daniel. I guess retirement's not going very well. Daniel grinned. I was about to say exactly the opposite. That afternoon, Walter received a call from an unfamiliar number. He answered cautiously. Hello, a woman's voice spoke. Mr. Bennett. Yes. My name is Laura Jenkins. Walter searched his memory. I'm sorry. I'm with the County Historical Society. Recognition dawned. Oh. We're organizing this year's Heritage Festival. Walter smiled. Margaret had volunteered for that committee for nearly 20 years. What can I do for you? We heard you might not be attending. Walter looked out the window. I wasn't planning on it. There was a brief silence. Laura spoke again. The community was hoping you'd still come. Walter didn't answer immediately. She continued. People expect to see you every year. Walter felt something tighten in his chest. They do. You started the festival. He smiled softly. My wife did. You both did. Walter thanked her and promised to think about it. After hanging up, he sat quietly for several minutes. Emily eventually noticed. Everything all right? Walter nodded. The town wants me at the festival. Will you go? He looked toward Margaret's photograph sitting on the bookshelf beside his bed. I don't know. Emily smiled gently. I think part of you already does. Meanwhile, Brent Lawson sat inside an expensive steakhouse meeting with several investors. One of them asked the question he'd been avoiding. How secure is the ownership? Brent smiled confidently. No issues. Another investor leaned forward. The old rancher won't contest it. Brent shook his head. As in a nursing home. The investors nodded, satisfied. None of them noticed a waitress setting down drinks behind them. Her name was Angela. She had grown up less than 5 miles from Bennett Ranch. She recognized every name she heard, especially Walter Bennett's. She kept her expression neutral, finished serving the table, and quietly memorized every word she could. That evening, Angela stopped by the ranch on her way home. Ryan answered the door. I'm sorry to bother you. Ryan smiled politely. Can I help you? I think you need to know something. 20 minutes later, after hearing everything she'd overheard, Ryan stood speechless. They're already talking to investors. Angela nodded. They acted like the deal was done. Ryan thanked her. As she drove away, he immediately reached for his phone. His thumb hovered over David's name. Then he lowered it. Instead, he called Walter. When Walter answered, Ryan spoke only 6 words. Dade. Walter immediately recognized the fear in his son's voice. What happened? Ryan swallowed. They've already sold your future. Walter closed his eyes. No. Ryan frowned. What? They've tried. Walter stood and looked out toward the darkening sky. But they haven't sold anything yet. For the first time in weeks, his voice carried the calm confidence of the man who had built Bennett Ranch from the ground up. And Ryan realized something. His father wasn't simply preparing to defend the ranch anymore. He was preparing to take it back. Walter barely slept. Not because Ryan's phone call had frightened him. It had done the opposite. For the first time since arriving at Sunrise Haven, the pieces were beginning to fit together. David hadn't moved him because he was worried. He had moved him because he thought distance meant control. Walter had made the same mistake once with a young bull that kept testing the fences. He'd assumed the animal was trying to escape. Margaret had laughed. She'd said, He's seeing if anyone's paying attention. She'd been right. People weren't much different. The next morning, Walter was sitting outside with a notebook when Emily found him. I didn't know you kept notes. Walter looked up. I always have. What kind? He handed her the notebook. The pages weren't filled with plans. They were questions. Who met with Brent first? When was the company formed? Who approved the equipment loans? Who benefits the most from selling? Emily looked impressed. You're investigating. Walter smiled. I'm trying to understand. Most people would be angry. I am. You don't look angry. Fine, close the notebook. My father used to say anger makes you loud, and the truth makes you patient. Emily nodded slowly. I like your father's advice. Walter chuckled. I didn't always. At the ranch, David called an emergency meeting. Only his brothers were there. He shut the office door. No one talks to Dad without telling me first. Ryan looked up immediately. Excuse me? You heard me. Mark rubbed his tired eyes. Why? David leaned forward. Because every time one of you visits him, something changes. Ryan folded his arms. Maybe because he's our father. David ignored the comment. Ryan, did you tell him about the developer? Ryan answered honestly. Yes. Mark's head snapped toward him. You what? He deserved to know. David slammed his hand on the desk. You had no right. Ryan stood. No puo. He met his brother's eyes. I had every right. Silence filled the room. Mark looked from one brother to the other. This isn't helping. Ryan turned toward David. When were you planning to tell him? David didn't answer. Ryan nodded. That's what I thought. He walked out. David didn't try to stop him. Mark waited until Ryan was gone. You've got about David glared at him. I've got two. No. Mark shook his head. You've got one. What? You think you're still in control. David looked away. For the first time, he wasn't sure Mark was wrong. Back at Sunrise Heaven, Walter joined Frank and John the back patio. George was staring at an old photograph. My company. He handed it to Walter. A dozen firefighters stood proudly in front of their engine. You miss them? George smiled. Every day. Walter nodded. I know the feeling. Frank looked at both men. You know what I miss? What? Being needed. Nobody laughed, because everyone understood. Walter looked around the patio. I've been thinking about that. Frank smiled. Dangerous. Walter ignored him. What if we've been asking the wrong question? George frowned. What question? Who's coming to visit? Frank shrugged. What should we ask? Walter smiled. Who can we still help? The three men sat quietly. George finally nodded. I like that one better. Later that afternoon, Emily walked into the activities room and stopped. Nearly a dozen residents were gathered around Walter. Not because he was telling stories, he was teaching them. An old woman wanted to know how to repair a loose cabinet hinge. Another resident asked about growing tomatoes. Frank was learning how to sharpen a pocket knife properly. Emily leaned against the doorway and smiled. Walter wasn't entertaining people. He was giving them confidence. When the group finally dispersed, she walked over. You've started something. Walter looked confused. What? A workshop. He laughed. I was just answering questions. Emily smiled. Exactly. Daniel Foster arrived just before lunch. I've got good news. Walter raised an eyebrow. I could use some. Daniel placed a certified copy of the property deed on the table. I verified everything with the county. Walter looked carefully at the seal. No changes. Daniel smiled. None. No transfers. Shh. None. No ownership challenges. Daniel shook his head. The ranch is still 100% yours. Walter exhaled slowly. Not from relief, from certainty. What about the trust? Daniel opened another folder. It still names the same future beneficiaries. Walter nodded. Good. Emily looked curious. You already have a plan for the ranch. Walter smiled gently. I've had one for years. She didn't ask another question. She sensed there was more to the story. Meanwhile, Brent Lawson received a phone call that immediately changed his mood. This is Lawson. A woman answered. I'm calling from the county clerk's office. Yes. There appears to be an issue with your ownership inquiry. Brent frowned. What issue? The listed owner doesn't match the supporting documents your office requested. Brent sat upright. What do you mean? The property is still registered solely under Walter James Bennett. Brent's face lost its color. There must be a mistake. I'm afraid there isn't. The call ended. Brent stared at the phone, then immediately dialed David. David answered on the second ring. What? We've got a serious problem. David frowned. What now? The county confirmed your father still owns everything? David was silent. Brent continued. I thought you said ownership had already been transferred. David's voice became noticeably quieter. I thought it had. You thought? David rubbed his forehead. My mother handled the paperwork. Brent stood from his chair. You built a multi-million-dollar deal on something you never verified. David didn't answer, because there was no answer that would make it sound any better. That evening, Ryan drove to Sunrise Heaven again. This time, he wasn't alone. Sophie climbed out beside him carrying a weathered wooden box. Walter smiled the moment he saw them. What's that? Sophie carefully placed the box on the table. I found it in Grandma's sewing room. Walter slowly opened the lid. Inside were dozens of old photographs, letters, receipts, and one small leather-bound notebook. Walter's expression changed immediately. He recognized it. Margaret's journal. He gently picked it up. I've been looking for this. Ryan looked surprised. You knew it existed. Walter nodded. Your mother wrote in it almost every night. Sophie smiled. Can we read it? Walter hesitated. Some of it? He opened to a random page. Margaret's handwriting filled the paper. Walter worries too much about teaching the boys how to run a ranch. I worry more about teaching them why the ranch matters. Walter swallowed hard. Another entry. A land isn't what we leave our children. Character is. Ryan looked away. The words hit harder than he expected. Walter carefully closed the journal. Your grandmother understood something I was slower to learn. What? Ryan asked quietly. Walter looked at both of them. You can leave someone an inheritance. He rested his hand on the journal. Or you can leave them values. He sighed. They're not always the same thing. As Ryan and Sophie prepared to leave, Walter noticed someone watching from the far end of the parking lot. A man in a dark sedan. The moment Walter looked directly at him, the car pulled away. Frowned. You know him? Walter shook his head. No. Daniel had warned him that developers didn't like surprises. And suddenly, Walter wasn't sure whether they were simply trying to buy his ranch anymore, or trying to find out exactly how much he already knew. Walter had dealt with enough salesmen over the years to recognize one simple truth. The friendliest smile often hid the biggest commission. The man in the dark sedan hadn't driven into Sunrise Heaven by accident. He hadn't looked lost. He'd looked curious. Curious people asked questions. Dangerous people watched quietly. Walter wasn't ready to decide which one this was. The next morning, he mentioned the car to Daniel. You recognize the description? Walter asked. Daniel thought for a moment. Black sedan. Walter nodded. Late 40s. Gray suit. Daniel frowned. I might. You know him? Not personally. Daniel pulled out his phone and searched through several photos from a recent county business luncheon. After a minute, he stopped. I think this is him. He turned the screen toward Walter. A clean-cut man stood beside Brent Lawson at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The caption identified him as Neil Granger, Director of Land Acquisitions for Lawson Development. Walter studied the photograph. I've never met him. Daniel slipped the phone back into his pocket. You don't have to. What do you mean? If Brent's getting nervous? Daniel smiled faintly. He sends someone else to gather information. Walter leaned back in his chair. So they're checking on me. I believe they are. Walter nodded slowly. Good. Daniel looked surprised. If they're watching me, Walter smiled. It means they're worried. Across town, Brent Lawson stormed into David's office without knocking. You lied to me. David looked up from his desk. I didn't. You told me ownership was settled. I believed it was. Brent slammed a folder onto the desk. I don't build million-dollar projects on beliefs. Mark looked up from the other side of the room. What's going on? Brent pointed at David. Your brother forgot one tiny detail. David glared at him. I didn't forget. Brent folded his arms. Then explain why your father still owns every acre. Mark stared at David. You never checked. David didn't answer. Brent laughed bitterly. I've seen careless. He shook his head. But this, he looked at both brothers. This is amateur hour. David's face turned red. We can still fix it. Brent's voice hardened. You've got 10 days, and if we don't, the investors walk. He headed for the door, and if they walk, he paused. They'll want to know exactly who wasted 6 months of their time. The office door slammed behind him. Neither brother spoke. Finally, Mark broke the silence. You should have told us. David rubbed his temples. I thought I had it handled. Mark shook his head. That's becoming a habit. Ryan spent the afternoon repairing fence posts along the eastern pasture. Sophie walked beside him carrying a bucket of nails. You've been quiet. Ryan smiled weakly. So have you? She shrugged. I'm thinking. About what? She drove another nail into the post. Grandpa? Ariane nodded. What about him? Never yells. Ryan laughed softly. No. But people still listen. Ryan looked across the pasture. That's because he doesn't waste words. Sophie smiled. I want to be like that. Ryan looked at his daughter. You already are. She looked surprised. I am. You notice things. She grinned. Grandpa says that's the first step. Ryan smiled. He would. As they finished the last fence post, Sophie pointed toward the highway. A black sedan sat parked on the shoulder. Watching the ranch, Ryan narrowed his eyes. The same type of car Walter had described. The sedan pulled away before Ryan could reach his truck. Back at Sunrise Haven, Emily found Walter in the library reading Margaret's journal. I hope I'm not interrupting. Walter closed the book gently. Not at all. She sat across from him. You've read that journal 3 times. I have. What keeps bringing you back? Walter smiled. Emily laughed. I suppose that's obvious. Walter ran his fingers across the worn leather cover. Margaret had a way of writing exactly what people needed to hear. Emily tilted her head. Read me something. Walter opened to a bookmark page. This one's from 23 years ago. He cleared his throat. Walter worries he'll never know if the boys are ready. I told him that's the wrong question. Children aren't ready because they reach a certain age. They're ready when responsibility matters more than reward. Sir Walter closed the journal. I didn't understand that back then. Emily looked thoughtful. And now, I think she was trying to prepare me. For this. Walter nodded. I just wish I'd listened sooner. That evening, Frank knocked on Walter's door. You busy? Walter looked up from his chair. Come on in. Frank carried a folded newspaper. You might want to see this. The front page featured a large photograph of David Bennett shaking hands with Brent Lawson. The headline read, "A Sears Historic Ranch expected to enter exciting new chapter." Walter read the article quietly. It described luxury homes, economic growth, new jobs. Not once did it mention Walter. Not once did it mention the Bennett family's history. Not once did it mention Margaret. Frank watched him carefully. You all right? Walter folded the newspaper. I've spent 50 years building something. He placed the paper on the table. It only took one article to make it sound like none of it mattered. Frank shook his head. It matters. Walter smiled faintly. To the right people. Later that night, Daniel called. I found something. Walter immediately sat up. What is it? I subpoenaed the incorporation records for David's real estate company. And there was another investor. Walter frowned. Ooh. Daniel hesitated. A private equity group. Walter had never heard the name. What does that mean? It means David promised more than land. Walter's expression hardened. What else? A promised possession by the end of the month. Walter slowly stood. The Heritage Festival. Daniel nodded. I think that's the deadline. Walter looked out his window toward the moonlit garden. So that's why they're rushing. They need your signature. Walter smiled. No. Daniel sounded confused. What? They need something much harder than that. What? Walter's eyes narrowed. They need me to stay quiet. At that exact moment, 200 miles away, Brent Lawson sat alone in his office reviewing every document connected to Bennett Ranch. One sentence from the county clerk kept echoing in his mind. Sole owners, Walter James Bennett. Brent picked up his phone. Get me everything you can on Walter Bennett. The voice on the other end asked, How far do you want us to go? Brent stared out the window before answering. As far as it takes. For the first time since this deal began, the battle was no longer about land, it was becoming personal. Walter had never believed that winning meant being louder than everyone else. On a ranch, the loudest man usually got kicked by the horse. The calm one noticed what everyone else missed. That lesson had served him well for more than 70 years. It was about to serve him again. Tuesday morning began with a surprise. Walter was halfway through breakfast when Linda, the receptionist, walked into the dining room. Mr. Bennett. Walter looked up. Yes, you have several visitors. Walter frowned. I wasn't expecting anyone. So they said. He followed her toward the lobby. Ryan was there. Sophie stood beside him. Daniel Foster leaned against the wall with his briefcase. And to Walter's complete surprise, Laura Jenkins from the County Historical Society was waiting as well. Walter smiled. This looks serious. Laura laughed. I hope not. They gathered in one of the meeting rooms. Laura placed several folders on the table. I wanted to speak with you before the Heritage Festival. Walter nodded. I'm listening. The committee voted unanimously. She smiled warmly. We'd like to honor you this year. Walter looked genuinely confused. For what? Ryan almost laughed. For building the festival. Walter shook his head. Margaret deserves that honor. Laura nodded. We're honoring both of you. Walter looked down for a moment. Margaret would have hated being the center of attention, but she would have loved seeing the community together. When is the ceremony? The opening morning. Walter looked at Daniel, then at Ryan, then at Sophie. Finally he smiled. I'll be there. Across town, David's phone rang. He answered without looking at the screen. What? Brent Lawson didn't waste time. The Historical Society just announced they'll honor your father. David frowned. So every newspaper in the county will be there. David sat upright. And, if Walter says one sentence about ownership, Brent paused. Our investors panic. David rubbed his forehead. He won't. You sound less confident every day. David didn't respond, because Brent was right. Later that afternoon, Emily joined Walter for a walk around the garden. You seem lighter today. Walter smiled. I made a decision. About the festival? He nodded. I almost stayed away. What changed? Walter stopped beside a flower bed. My wife used to tell me something every spring. Emily waited. If you stop showing up, someone else writes your story. Emily smiled. She sounds wise. Walter laughed softly. She usually was. They continued walking. After a few minutes, Emily asked, Are you nervous? Walter looked toward the sky. Little? Why? Because standing up to strangers is easy. He paused. Standing up to your children. He shook his head. That's different. Emily gently touched his arm. You don't have to stop loving them to stop enabling them. Walter looked at her for several seconds. No. He smiled sadly. I suppose I don't. Mark's situation was getting worse. He walked out of the bank carrying another rejection letter. No loan, no extension, no help. His phone buzzed immediately. The debt collector. He ignored it. It rang again. Then again. Finally he answered. I'm trying. You've got 5 days. I need more time. You've already had more time. The voice lowered. If we don't get our money. A long pause. We'll come collect something else. The line went dead. Mark leaned against his truck. For the first time, he admitted something to himself. Selling the ranch wasn't going to solve his problems. It was only going to delay them. Ryan spent the evening cleaning out one of the old tack rooms. He hadn't opened it in years. Most of the shelves held dusty horse blankets, rusted tools, and cracked leather saddles. Near the back, he found a wooden chest. Inside were dozens of cassette tapes. Each one had a handwritten label. Cattle auction, 1998. Margaret's birthday. Sophie's first horse. Ryan smiled. Then he found one labeled simply, family meeting. He carried the tape into the farmhouse. The old cassette player still worked. Static filled the room. Then Walter's younger voice came through the speakers. If something ever happens to me. Ryan froze. The recording continued. I don't want you boys fighting over this ranch. Margaret laughed softly. They won't. Walter chuckled. I hope you're right. The tape went silent for a moment before Walter continued. This land doesn't belong to us. Ryan closed his eyes. He knew the sentence before it came. We belong to it. Ryan turned off the recorder. His father had said those words nearly 20 years ago. Back then, none of them had understood. That night, Daniel arrived with another update. I've confirmed the investors are attending the Heritage Festival. Walter nodded. I expected that. They think David's making the announcement after your award ceremony. Walter smiled. They've planned quite a day. Daniel looked carefully at him. You've got something in mind. Walter answered honestly. I do. Daniel leaned forward. You going to confront David? Walter shook his head. No. Then what? I'm going to give him one final opportunity. To do what? Walter looked out the window. Tell the truth himself. Daniel smiled. And if he doesn't? Walter closed Margaret's journal. Then I'll do it for him. The next morning, Walter called Ryan. I need you to do something, anything. Invite your brothers. Ryan frowned. To Sunrise Haven. Yes. They won't come. Walter smiled. Tell them I want to sign the paperwork. Ryan went silent. Dad? I know exactly what I'm saying. You don't mean it. No. Oh. Walter's voice remained calm. But they don't know that. Ryan finally understood. You want to see what they bring. Walter smiled. Exactly. If they arrived with honest documents, there was still hope. If they arrived with lies, Walter would finally know just how far they were willing to go. Before ending the call, Walter added one more thing. Ryan. Yeah. No matter what happens tomorrow. He paused. Remember that this family is worth fighting for, even when the people in it forget that. And if you've been following this journey, I'd love to hear what you think. What would you do if you were in Walter's position? Share your thoughts below, and if you're enjoying the story, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. Ryan slowly lowered the phone. He stared across the pastures stretching toward the horizon. Tomorrow would change everything. Because for the first time since Walter entered the nursing home, all three Bennett brothers would be sitting across the table from the man they believed they had already defeated. Only one of them knew the truth, and Walter intended to keep it that way, at least for a little while longer. Ryan barely slept that night. He lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch, the wind against the old oak outside his bedroom, the distant call of a coyote, the soft creak of the farmhouse settling as the temperature dropped. For the first time in years, he wondered what his father had heard every night while everyone else slept. Not just the sounds, the worries, the responsibility, the weight of knowing that one bad season could cost a family everything. Maybe that was why Walter had seemed so calm all these years. He'd learned to carry heavy things quietly. David didn't answer Ryan's first call, or the second. He finally picked up on the third. What? Dade wants to see all of us. David frowned. Why? He says he's ready to sign. Silence. Ryan could almost hear his brother thinking. What exactly did he say? That he's ready to sign the paperwork. David lowered his voice. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock, at the nursing home. Yeah, I'll be there. The line went dead. Ryan stared at his phone. His father had been right. David hadn't asked how Walter was doing. He hadn't asked why his father suddenly changed his mind. Only one thing mattered. The signature. Mark received the same call. He wants to sign. That's what he said. Mark rubbed his tired face. You sure? That's what I was told. Mark looked at the overdue bills covering his kitchen table. If this is real, he stopped. Ryan finished the sentence for him. It solves a lot of problems. Mark answered quietly. Yeah, but maybe not the right ones. Walter was already dressed when Daniel Foster arrived. You look like you're heading to court. Walter smiled. In a way, I suppose I am. Daniel placed his briefcase on the table. You still want me here? I do. And the documents? Walter nodded. Bring everything. Daniel studied him. You know what they'll bring? I have an idea. You think they'll bring transfer papers? Walter smiled faintly. If that's their goal, Daniel finished the thought, they'll come prepared. Walter looked out toward the garden. And if they don't? Daniel nodded. That tells us something too. Emily found Walter in the hallway. Nervous? A little? She smiled. That's normal. Walter chuckled. I've negotiated cattle sales with people twice my size. I know. This feels harder. Because they're your sons. Walter nodded. Emily looked at him carefully. Whatever happens today. She paused. Don't let guilt make your decision. Walter looked at her. You think I'm feeling guilty? I think every good parent does. Walter smiled sadly. You're probably right. At exactly 10 o'clock, David walked into Sunrise Haven. He wore an expensive suit, carried a leather portfolio, and smiled just enough to look convincing. Mark arrived 2 minutes later. Ryan was already waiting in the lobby. The three brothers stood together awkwardly. No one spoke. Linda finally appeared. Mr. Bennett is ready for you. Walter was sitting at a round conference table. Daniel Foster sat beside him. Several folders rested neatly in front of him. Emily stood near the coffee station, pretending to organize supplies. She wasn't eavesdropping. She simply wanted to make sure Walter wasn't alone. David smiled. Dad. Walter nodded. Morning. How are you feeling? Walter looked at him for a moment. I'm doing well. That's good. David took a seat. So, Walter waited. You said you wanted to sign. I did. David immediately opened his portfolio. Several documents appeared. Transfer of ownership, management authority, property assignment. Walter recognized every form. He also noticed something else. Not one document had been explained. Not one page had been highlighted. David simply slid them across the table. These just update the records. Walter looked at the first page. Do they? David smiled. Routine paperwork. Walter looked at Daniel. Daniel quietly adjusted his glasses. He said nothing. Walter turned another page. This transfers full ownership. David's smile faded. It's standard. Walter looked up. Is it? David hesitated. For estate planning. Walter nodded slowly. I see. He continued reading. The next document granted authority to sell the ranch without additional approval. The one after that dissolved portions of the family trust. Walter placed the papers neatly back on the table. Then he folded his hands. David. Yeah. When were you planning to explain these? David blinked. I just did. Walter shook his head. No. He tapped the first page. You described them. Then the second. You summarized them. Finally, he looked directly into his oldest son's eyes. You never explained them. The room became very quiet. Mark leaned forward. Dad? Walter raised a hand. Let me ask one question. Nobody interrupted. If I signed these? He looked at all three sons. What would happen to Bennett Ranch? David answered immediately. It stays in the family. Walter looked at Daniel. Daniel slowly slid another folder across the table. Inside were copies of Brent Lawson's development plans, luxury homes, commercial lots, a Berschelf course. Walter pushed them toward David. Is this the family you're talking about? David stared at the papers. His face lost all color. Mark whispered, Where'd you get those? Walter didn't answer. Ryan slowly picked up the top page. His heart sank. He'd suspected. Now he knew. David finally spoke. You had someone spying on us? Walter looked genuinely disappointed. That's your first question. David said nothing. Walter sighed. I was hoping. He glanced at Margaret's wedding ring still on his finger. I was hoping one of you would tell me the truth. Nobody did. Not even now. Walter stood. His voice never rose. I invited you here today for one reason. He looked at each of his sons. I wanted to know whether my family was trying to protect me. His eyes settled on David. Or take advantage of me. David stood too. You don't understand. Walter nodded. Then help me. I can explain. Walter smiled sadly. I've been waiting weeks for that. David opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Across the room, Emily quietly watched. She had seen family argue before. She had seen anger, regret, grief. But what she saw on Walter's face was different. It wasn't rage. It was heartbreak. And somehow, that hurt far more. As the meeting ended, David gathered his unsigned papers with shaking hands. For the first time since Walter entered Sunrise Haven, his plan had failed. Not because his father outsmarted him. Because his father had simply read every page. And outside the conference room window, an unfamiliar black SUV slowly pulled into the parking lot. Daniel noticed it first. He recognized the driver immediately. Brent Lawson had finally decided to get involved himself. Daniel's expression changed the moment he saw the black SUV. Walter noticed. "You know him?" Daniel gave a slight nod.
I do. Brent. Yeah.
Walter looked through the window as Brent Lawson stepped out, adjusted his suit jacket, and headed toward the entrance. He came himself. Daniel quietly gathered the folders on the table. That means he's worried. Walter smiled faintly. Good. Ryan looked through the glass doors. Should we leave? Walter shook his head. No. David was already stuffing the unsigned documents back into his portfolio. His confidence from an hour earlier had disappeared. Mark looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Emily quietly moved toward the hallway, making sure other residents stayed clear of the meeting room. The last thing Walter wanted was a public scene inside Sunrise Haven. A firm knock came at the door. Before anyone answered, Brent opened it. He stepped inside wearing an expensive charcoal suit and a smile that had probably closed 100 business deals. "Mr. Bennett." Walter remained seated. "Mr. Lawson." Brent looked around the room. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Walter smiled politely. "I think you already did." Ryan watched Brent carefully. This was the man who had spent months convincing David that selling the ranch was the future. In person, he looked exactly as Ryan imagined. Confident, charming, calculated. Brent extended his hand toward Walter. "I've wanted to meet you for quite some time." Walter looked at the hand, then back at Brent. "I'm sure you have." The handshake never happened. Brent smoothly withdrew his hand as though nothing unusual had occurred. "I understand there seems to have been a misunderstanding," Brent began. Walter tilted his head. "What kind?" "The ownership records." Walter almost smiled. "I don't believe the county misunderstood anything." Brent chuckled lightly. "No, of course not." He pulled out a chair. "May I?" Walter nodded. Brent sat down. "The Bennett Ranch has incredible potential." Walter answered quietly. "It already reached its potential." Brent smiled patiently. "I disagree." Walter looked directly at him. "I figured you would." Brent opened a glossy presentation folder. Colorful renderings filled the pages. Walking trails, private lakes, luxury homes, a shopping district. He turned the folder toward Walter. "Imagine what this community could become." Walter glanced at the first page for barely 2 seconds. Then he gently pushed it back. "I don't have to imagine," Brent frowned. "Pardon. I already know what that land can become." Walter looked toward Ryan. "It became 3 good boys once." His voice softened. "It became my grandchildren." He thought of Margaret. "It became a home." Walter looked back at Brent. "I don't need another golf course." Ryan lowered his eyes. Mark looked away. Even David couldn't bring himself to meet his father's gaze. Brent changed tactics. "I understand the emotional attachment." Walter almost laughed. "You don't." "I assure you." "No." Walter interrupted him for the first time. "You understand land value." He leaned forward. "I understand family value." The room became silent. Brent closed the presentation folder. "I can make you a very generous offer." Walter smiled. "I know. You haven't heard the number." "I don't need to." Brent folded his hands. "Everyone has a price." Walter looked at Margaret's wedding ring. "No." He slowly shook his head. "Everything doesn't." David finally spoke. "Dad?" Walter held up a hand. "Not yet." David fell silent again. Brent looked between them. "I don't think refusing this opportunity benefits anyone." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "You're probably right." Brent looked full. "It benefits you." Brent's smile faded. Walter continued. "Benefits your investors." Another pause. "It benefits my oldest son's bank account." David's face turned bright red. Walter leaned back. "But tell me." He looked directly at Brent. "Who exactly does it benefit after the last fence comes down?" Brent had no immediate answer. Daniel opened his briefcase. "I believe this belongs in the conversation." He laid several documents on the table. Financial projections, corporate filings, emails connecting Brent and David's development company. Brent's expression hardened. "Where did you get those?" Daniel smiled professionally. "Legally." Walter noticed Brent's calm beginning to crack. That told him something important. The papers were real. Emily stood quietly near the doorway. She had promised herself she wouldn't interfere. But listening to Walter defend the ranch wasn't what caught her attention. It was the way he spoke. There wasn't bitterness in his voice. Only conviction. He wasn't trying to win an argument. He was protecting something he loved. She finally understood why everyone in the county respected him. Leadership had never come from raising his voice. It came from standing firm. Mark suddenly pushed back his chair. "I can't do this." Everyone turned toward him. He looked exhausted, more exhausted than Walter had ever seen him. "I've lied enough." David stared at him. "What are you doing?" Mark ignored him. He looked directly at Walter. "Day dull." His voice cracked. Walter said nothing. "I owe people money." "Still nothing." "I thought selling the ranch would fix it." A tear rolled down Mark's cheek. "It won't." David stood abruptly. "Stop talking." Mark looked at his brother. "No. You don't know what you're spraying. I know exactly what I'm saying." Mark turned back toward Walter. "I was wrong?" Walter's eyes filled. Not because of the debt, because for the first time, one of his sons had finally chosen honesty. Brent stood. "This is clearly a family matter." Walter nodded. "It always was." Brent buttoned his suit jacket. "We'll continue this discussion another time." Walter smiled. "No?" Brent paused. "No. There won't be another discussion. You haven't heard our final offer." Walter looked out the window toward the small garden. "My wife planted wildflowers every spring." Brent frowned, confused by the change in subject. Walter continued. "One year someone asked her how much she'd sell that flower bed for." He smiled softly. "She said they were asking the wrong question." Brent folded his arms. "What was the right question?" Walter looked him straight in the eye. "Why would I sell something that already gives me everything money can't buy?" Brent stared at him for several seconds. Then, without another word, he picked up his presentation folder and walked out. The room remained silent long after the door closed. Finally, Ryan spoke. "Dad." Walter looked at him. "I'm sorry." Walter smiled sadly. "I know." Ryan wasn't apologizing for today. He was apologizing for all the days before it. Walter understood. As everyone slowly left the meeting room, Daniel remained behind. He closed the door. "I think Brent's finished asking politely." Walter nodded. "I think so too." Daniel lowered his voice. "He'll look for another way." Walter looked toward the window where Brent's SUV disappeared through the front gate. "I've been expecting that." Daniel frowned. "What do we do now?" Walter's answer came without hesitation. "We stop reacting." He reached for Margaret's journal. "It's time we make the next move." Outside, Brent sat behind the wheel of his SUV without starting the engine. He dialed a number from memory. The call was answered almost immediately. "I need everything you've got on the Bennett family." A pause. "And especially." His eyes remained fixed on Sunrise Haven. Find out who might convince Walter Bennett to change his mind. The game had entered a dangerous new stage. Because Brent Lawson had stopped trying to buy the ranch. Now he intended to find Walter Bennett's weakness. He had no idea. Walter's greatest strength had always been the family Brent believed was his greatest weakness. Walter had learned something about pressure long before he became a father. Pressure didn't create character. It revealed it. You saw it during droughts, during bad harvests, during funerals, and now, he was seeing it inside his own family. Mark had confessed. Ryan had chosen honesty. Only David was still pretending everything could be fixed with another signature. Walter prayed it wasn't too late for him. The morning after Brent's visit, Sunrise Haven felt unusually peaceful. Residents gathered in the courtyard for coffee. Someone had brought homemade cinnamon rolls. Frank complained there weren't enough raisins. Helen reminded him he'd complained about raisins the week before. George laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. Walter smiled. Life had a strange way of continuing, even when everything else felt uncertain. Emily walked over carrying a clipboard. "I've got good news." Walter raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "You've officially graduated from physical therapy." Walter chuckled. "I passed." "You passed. So I don't have to do those balance exercises anymore." Emily smiled. "Oh, you'll still do them." Walter groaned dramatically. "I knew there was a catch." She laughed. "But now you'll do them because you choose to." Walter stood and stretched. "I suppose that's better." Emily looked at him for a moment. "You know." "What?" "When you first got here." She paused. "You looked like someone waiting for life to end." Walter nodded slowly. "And now?" "You look like someone getting ready to go home." Walter looked toward the eastern sky. "I hope I am." Across town, David sat alone in the ranch office. Brent hadn't called. That worried him more than if he had. His phone buzzed. "Unknown number," he answered. "Hello, this is Harold Pierce." David frowned. "The investor?" "Yes. I understand there have been complications." David forced confidence into his voice. "Nothing we can't solve." Harold didn't sound convinced. "My partners are getting nervous." "The land is still available." "Is it?" David hesitated. Harold continued. "We invested because you assured us ownership wouldn't be an issue." "It won't be. Your father still owns the ranch." David closed his eyes. "We're working on it?" Harold's voice turned cold. "We didn't invest in possibilities. The line went dead. David stared at the phone. For the first time, he realized something terrifying. Brent wasn't the only person expecting results. Mark pulled into the ranch an hour later. He found David sitting on the porch steps. "You all right?" David didn't answer. Mark sat beside him. "You know what? I kept blaming my gambling." David finally looked over. "And? I was wrong." David frowned. "What do you mean? I've got a gambling problem." He looked toward the pastures. "But you've got a pride problem." David didn't respond. Mark continued. "You'd rather lose the ranch than admit you made a mistake." David stood abruptly. "You don't know what you're talking about." Mark watched him walk away. Deep down, he knew he did. Ryan spent the afternoon with Sophie repairing the old windmill near the north pasture. Walter had taught both of them how years earlier. Sophie tightened the final bolt. "I think that's it." Ryan spun the wheel by hand. The old windmill creaked once, then slowly began turning in the breeze. Water flowed into the stock tank. Sophie smiled. "Grandpa always said to fix things before they completely break." Ryan nodded. He was talking about more than windmills. She looked at him. "You think Uncle David will ever listen?" Ryan sighed. "I don't know. What if he doesn't?" Ryan stared across the ranch. "Then Grandpa will have to make a hard decision." Back at Sunrise Haven, Daniel arrived carrying a large envelope. "I've got something you should see." Walter opened it carefully. Inside were copies of every newspaper advertisement for the Heritage Festival. His eyes stopped on one full-page spread. The schedule listed 10:00 a.m. Walter and Margaret Bennett Community Legacy Award 11:00 a.m. Exciting announcement about the future of Bennett Ranch. Walter smiled sadly. "They really plan to honor us." He looked at the second event. "And erase us an hour later." Daniel nodded. "I believe that was the idea." Walter folded the paper. "Not anymore." Emily knocked gently before entering Walter's room that evening. "I brought something." She handed him a small cardboard box. Walter looked puzzled. "What's this?" The maintenance staff was throwing out old supplies. Walter opened the box. Inside was a beautifully carved wooden nameplate. It simply read Walter Bennett. He looked confused. "It used to hang on your room." Emily smiled. "You've been fixing everything around here. So, I thought your room should finally feel like yours." Walter ran his fingers across the carved letters. "No one's done something this thought for me in a long time." Emily shrugged. "It wasn't a big thing." Walter looked at her. "It was." He carefully placed the nameplate on the bookshelf beside Margaret's photograph. For a moment, the room felt a little less temporary. That same evening, Brent Lawson met privately with Neil Granger. "How'd it go?" Neil asked. Brent poured himself a cup of coffee. "Walter won't sell." Neil nodded. "I expected that." Brent leaned against the window. "But people around him might." Neil understood immediately. "The sons. Especially the oldest." Brent handed Neil a folder. "I want you to learn everything about David Bennett." Neil opened it. "What am I looking for?" Brent's answer was simple. "Pressure points." Later that night, Walter's phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. He answered cautiously. "This is Walter." A woman's voice came through, trembling slightly. "Mr. Bennett." "Yes? My name is Karen Ellis." Walter searched his memory. "I don't believe we've met." "We haven't." She hesitated. "I used to work for Lawson Development." Walter sat up straighter. "Used to. I resigned 3 weeks ago." Walter waited. "There are things you need to know." Walter glanced toward Margaret's journal. "What kind of things?" Karen lowered her voice. "I have copies of internal emails." Walter's heartbeat quickened. "Emails about what?" "The Bennett Ranch." He stood slowly. "They prove your sons weren't told the whole truth." Walter frowned. "What do you mean?" Karen took a deep breath. "Mr. Lawson never intended to preserve any part of your ranch." Walter wasn't surprised, but her next sentence stopped him cold. "And according to those emails..." She paused. "The old Bennett farmhouse was scheduled to be demolished during the very first week of construction." Walter closed his eyes. The farmhouse. The porch where Margaret drank her morning coffee. The kitchen where she taught Sophie to bake pecan pie. The doorway where the boys' heights had been marked year after year. Gone. Reduced to rubble. Walter opened his eyes again. His voice was calm. Almost too calm. "Miss Ellis." "Yes. I think it's time we met." Because if those emails were real, Walter finally had the evidence that could expose not only Brent Lawson, but everyone who had knowingly helped him. Walter arrived at the small visitors' lounge 20 minutes early. Old habits. If someone was willing to risk their career to tell the truth, they deserved not to be kept waiting. Daniel Foster was already there. He placed a legal pad on the table. "You trust her?" Walter answered honestly. "I don't know." Daniel nodded. "Good. Walter smiled. I trust evidence. A few minutes later, a woman in her early 50s walked through the door. She carried a plain canvas tote bag, no expensive briefcase, no dramatic entrance. She looked like someone who hadn't slept well in weeks. You must be Karen. She nodded nervously. And you're Mr. Bennett. Walter stood and shook her hand. Thank you for coming. I almost didn't. Walter gestured toward the chair. But you did. She sat. I couldn't keep pretending. Karen slowly opened the tote bag. Inside were several folders and a flash drive. I printed the important emails. Daniel immediately noticed the company letterhead. Original correspondence. Karen nodded. I copied everything before I resigned. Walter looked at her. Why? She smiled sadly. My father owned a peach orchard. Walter listened. A developer promised he'd preserve part of it. She looked down at the papers. They bulldozed every tree. Walter understood. So when I saw your ranch, Karen nodded. I knew exactly how the story would end. Daniel carefully reviewed the documents. Each page made his expression more serious. What is it? Walter asked. Daniel turned one sheet toward him. An email from Brent Lawson to several executives. Subject: Bennett Ranch acquisition. Walter read silently. Once ownership transfers, remove all existing structures immediately. The farmhouse has no commercial value. His grip tightened. He continued reading. Historical designation request should be delayed until demolition is complete. Walter looked up. They planned this. Karen nodded. Months ago. Daniel flipped to another page. This one included projected profits. Golf course. Private lake. Retail center. The old red barn was labeled future parking lot. Walter closed his eyes. His grandfather had raised that barn with hand tools and mule teams. Margaret had decorated it every Christmas. Children had danced there during every heritage festival. To Brent, it was a parking lot. Emily knocked gently before entering. I brought coffee. She noticed the heavy mood immediately. I can come back. Walter shook his head. No. She placed the tray on the table. Karen stood. I'm Karen. Emily. They shook hands. Emily looked toward Walter. You all right? Walter smiled faintly. I will be. Emily glanced at the papers. She didn't ask questions. She simply rested a hand on Walter's shoulder for a brief moment, then quietly left the room. Karen watched the exchange. She cares about you. Walter nodded. She reminds me that good people still exist. Across town, David was standing in the old barn. Workers were setting up decorations for the Heritage Festival. Banners, tables, a stage. Everything looked exactly as it had every year, except for one thing. The massive display at the center of the barn. A giant rendering of the future subdivision. David stared at it. Luxury homes covered every pasture. The creek had been reshaped into decorative ponds. The orchard was gone. The cattle were gone. The barn itself, gone. He suddenly remembered being 8 years old. Walter had lifted him onto the hayloft beam. One day this place will be yours to protect, and not yours to sell. Protect. David slowly looked away. For the first time, he couldn't bring himself to admire the display. Mark walked into the barn carrying extension cords. He stopped beside his brother. You all right? David didn't answer. Mark followed his gaze. The picture doesn't look the same anymore, does it? David sighed. No. Mark looked around the empty barn. You know what I keep thinking about? What? Mom. David smiled sadly. She'd be furious. Mark shook his head. No. What? She'd be disappointed. David lowered his eyes. That somehow hurt even more. Back at Sunrise Heaven, Daniel finished reviewing the final email. This changes everything. Walter looked at him. Legally. Daniel nodded. And publicly. Karen reached into her bag one last time. I almost forgot. She handed Walter a small envelope. He opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note. Not from Brent. From one of the junior project managers. It read, Mr. Lawson says once the old man signs, the family won't matter anymore. Walter folded the note slowly. They never saw us as people. Daniel answered quietly. They saw an obstacle. Walter stood and walked to the window. The afternoon sun lit the courtyard where Frank and George were arguing over a chess game. Life continued, peacefully. He wondered how many families had lost their homes because no one had stood up in time. He wasn't going to let that happen again. Ryan arrived just before dinner. Walter handed him the photographs of the proposed development. Ryan studied them carefully. I've never seen these. They came from inside Lawson Development. Ryan looked at Walter. So it's true. Walter nodded. They plan to level everything. Ryan swallowed. The farmhouse too. Walter handed him the email. Ryan read it twice. His hands began to shake. They lied to all of us. Walter didn't correct him, because Ryan had reached the conclusion on his own. I thought. Ryan paused. I thought they were going to build around the house. Walter smiled sadly. So did David. Ryan looked surprised. You think he didn't know? Walter nodded. I think he believed the promises. Ryan looked toward the window. Then Uncle Brent. Walter gently interrupted. Mr. Lawson. Ryan nodded. Mr. Lawson played all of us. Walter rested a hand on his son's shoulder. Some people make a living convincing their partners. He looked back at the documents. When really now? They're only customers. That evening, David received a text message from Brent. As need to meet immediately. Don't bring your brothers. David stared at the message. Something felt different. For months, Brent had spoken to him like a business partner. Now, the wording sounded like instructions. Not a request, an order. David drove into town after dark. Brent was waiting inside his office. The moment David walked in, Brent closed the door. We've got a problem. David sighed. I know. No. Brent slid a folder across the desk. You don't? David opened it. Inside were copies of every payment Lawson Development had made to his real estate company. Consulting fees, development bonuses, performance incentives. David frowned. I've seen these. Brent smiled. Look at the bottom. David turned to the final page. One sentence had been highlighted. All compensation is contingent upon successful transfer of ownership. David looked up. What does that mean? Brent didn't smile this time. It means... He leaned back in his chair. If the ranch isn't transferred... He paused just long enough for the words to sink in. You owe every penny back. David's face went pale. The amount was staggering. Far more than he could ever repay. Brent calmly folded his hands. So I suggest... He smiled without warmth. You convince your father. As David walked back to his truck an hour later, he realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. He had never been Brent Lawson's partner. He had been his insurance policy. And now, he was trapped. David didn't remember the drive back to the ranch. He remembered starting the truck. He remembered pulling onto the highway. After that, nothing. His mind kept replaying the same sentence. You owe every penny back. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. For months, Brent Lawson had praised him, called him a visionary, a businessman, a leader. Now David understood the truth. He had never been any of those things to Brent. He had been useful. Nothing more. The ranch was quiet when he arrived. The porch light was still on. Ryan was sitting in one of the old rocking chairs, waiting. David climbed the steps without saying a word. Ryan looked over. You all right? David laughed bitterly. No. Ryan waited. For once, he didn't push. After several minutes, David finally spoke. He lied to me. Ryan wasn't surprised. I know. David looked at his younger brother. No. He shook his head. You don't. Ryan remained silent. David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He never planned to keep the farmhouse. Ryan closed his eyes. Dad told me. David looked up sharply. You knew. Since this afternoon. And you didn't call me? Ryan answered quietly. I wanted you to hear it from someone who'd been lying to you. David looked away. The words stung. Because they were true. The following morning, Walter sat alone in the Sunrise Haven garden. Margaret's journal rested in his lap. He wasn't reading it. He was remembering. The first time he'd brought Margaret to the ranch. She'd stepped out of his pickup, looked across the rolling pasture and smiled. You really think you own all this? He'd laughed. I do. She'd picked up a handful of dirt. Numph. She'd let it fall through her fingers. It owns you. At 23 years old, he'd thought she was teasing. Now, he knew she'd been right. Emily joined him with 2 cups of coffee. You look peaceful. Walter accepted the cup. I've been thinking about my wife. Emily smiled. That's becoming a pattern. Walter chuckled. She keeps winning arguments. Even now? Especially now? Emily sat beside him. You know what? I think she'd be proud of you. Walter looked down. I hope so. Emily hesitated. I've been wanting to ask you something. Go ahead. When this is all over, Walter looked at her. What do you want? He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he smiled. I want breakfast on my own porch. Emily laughed softly. That's it? Walter nodded. That's everything. Daniel arrived carrying another folder. I've been looking into Brent Lawson. Walter raised an eyebrow. And he has a pattern. Daniel opened the file. 3 ranches, 2 orchards, a historic dairy farm, each purchased with promises of preservation, each completely demolished within months. Walter slowly turned the pages. Families smiling during closing ceremonies, newspaper headlines celebrating growth, then photos of bulldozers, empty fields, parking lots. Walter closed the file. How many? Daniel answered quietly. You're the 4th. Walter looked toward the sky. Not if I can help it. At the ranch, Mark was repairing the fence near the cemetery where generations of Bennetts were buried. David walked up carrying 2 shovels. We need to clear the weeds. Mark looked surprised. Now, David nodded. They shouldn't look like this. Without another word, both brothers began working. Neither mentioned the development, or Brent, or money. For nearly 2 hours, they simply cleaned the family cemetery. When they finished, David stood in front of Walter and Margaret's future headstone. The stone already bore their names. Only the dates beneath Walter's name remained blank. David stared at it for a long time. I don't think Dad would ever forgive me. Mark laid a hand on his shoulder. Maybe. David shook his head. No. Mark looked at the freshly cleaned graves. You know what Grandpa used to say? David smiled faintly. The truth doesn't erase mistakes. Mark nodded. But it stops you from making bigger ones. The brothers stood quietly. For the first time in years, neither of them was thinking about money. Later that afternoon, Sophie visited Walter again. She carried a faded photo album. I found these. Walter smiled the moment he saw it. The old branding days. Sophie sat beside him. Who's this? She pointed to a young boy covered in mud. Walter laughed. Your father. Ryan looked up for the other photograph and smiled. He fell into the stock pond trying to impress Grandpa. Walter chuckled. He blamed the horse. Sophie laughed. What did you do? Walter grinned. I made him clean every saddle in the barn. Ryan smiled at the memory. I was mad for 2 days. Walter looked at him. You still cleaned them? Ryan nodded. I did. Sophie flipped another page. There was David at 16, proudly holding a blue ribbon from the county livestock show. He looks happy. Walter smiled. He worked harder than anyone that year. Ryan looked at the picture. What happened? Walter didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, life. That evening, David parked outside Sunrise Haven. He sat in the truck for nearly 15 minutes. Twice he reached for the door handle. Twice he stopped. Finally, he got out. Linda recognized him. Your father's in the garden. David nodded. Thanks. Walter was trimming dead flowers from one of the garden beds. He looked up as footsteps approached. David. Dead? Walter set the gardening shears aside. Neither man spoke. Finally, David broke the silence. I came to apologize. Walter waited. I lied? Walter nodded. I know. I let Brett convince me this was the right thing. Walter remained quiet. I thought... David's voice faltered. I thought selling the ranch would solve everything. Walter looked directly at him. Did it? David slowly shook his head. No. Walter motioned toward the bench. Sit. David did. For several minutes they watched butterflies moving between the flowers. Finally Walter spoke. Do you know why your mother loved gardens? David smiled faintly. Because they were pretty. Walter laughed softly. None. He gently removed another dead blossom. Because every spring she had to trust that something buried would come back to life. David looked down. Dad? Walter interrupted him. An apology is a beginning. David looked hopeful. But it's not the end. David nodded. I know. Walter looked at him. If you really want to make this right, David leaned forward. Then stop protecting yourself. Walter's voice remained calm. Start protecting what's true. David swallowed hard. He knew exactly what his father meant. The Heritage Festival was only 4 days away. The entire county would be there, including Brent Lawson. Walter stood and picked up the gardening shears. I'll ask you Dad a question. David nodded. Anything. When everyone is watching, Walter looked him straight in the eye. Whose side are you going to stand on? David didn't answer. Not because he didn't know. Because he was finally beginning to understand what the answer would cost. As he walked back toward his truck, his phone vibrated. A new message from Brent Lawson. Nicer, I trust your father is becoming more cooperative. Now David stared at the screen. Then, for the first time since this whole nightmare began, he didn't reply. Brent looked at the unread message notification from his office. A slow frown crossed his face. Something had changed. David Bennett was no longer behaving like a man chasing a fortune. He was starting to act like a son. 3 days remained until the Bennett Ranch Heritage Festival. For the rest of the county, it was a celebration. For Walter Bennett, it was a deadline. He stood outside Sunrise Haven just after sunrise, watching the first light settle across the trees. Margaret used to love mornings like this. The day's honest before people wake up, she'd often say. Walter smiled to himself. She had been right about that too. Emily stepped outside carrying 2 travel mugs. I guessed you'd be here. Walter accepted one. You've started predicting me. She laughed. I'm getting better at it. They stood quietly for a moment. Finally, Emily asked, Are you afraid? Walter answered honestly, Yes. She looked surprised. I didn't expect that. Walter took a sip of coffee. I'm not afraid of losing the ranch. No, I'm afraid of losing my family. Emily nodded slowly. Sometimes saving a family means telling them the truth. Walter looked toward the rising sun. I hope they believe that. Across town, David sat alone in the ranch office. Brent had called 4 times. He ignored every call. The 5th time, Brent showed up in person. He walked in without knocking. You've been difficult to reach. David didn't look up. I've been busy. Brent closed the office door. We need to finalize the announcement. David remained silent. Brent laid a printed speech on the desk. I even had someone prepare your remarks. David picked up the pages. The first sentence read, "Today marks the beginning of an exciting new future for Bennett Ranch." He read no further. What if I don't give this speech? Brent smiled. You will. David slowly placed the pages back on the desk. And if I don't? Brent's smile disappeared. You signed contracts. I know. You accepted advance payments. I know. You made promises. David looked him in the eye. I know. Brent leaned closer. Then don't make this harder than it has to be. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, David answered. I'll be at the festival. Brent nodded. I expected nothing less. As soon as Brent left, David tore the speech into small pieces and dropped it into the trash. Ryan found him a few minutes later. What happened? David pointed toward the trash can. My future. Ryan picked up one of the torn pages. He read a few words before looking back at his brother. You finally see him. David nodded. I should have listened to Dad. Ryan smiled sadly. We all should have. At Sunrise Haven, Daniel arrived with encouraging news. The county approved your request. Walter looked up. They did? Daniel smiled. The Historical Society added one change to the ceremony. What kind? Laura Jenkins walked in behind him carrying a folder. Would like you to speak. Walter blinked. I thought David was speaking. Laura hesitated. He was. Walter understood immediately. And now? The committee decided the founder of the festival should have the microphone. Walter smiled gently. I'll try not to bore everyone. Laura laughed. I don't think that's possible. Frank overheard part of the conversation. You giving a speech? Walter nodded. Frank grinned. Don't forget us little people. George laughed. If he forgets us, we'll remind him. Walter looked around at his friends. I've spent my whole life talking to cattle. Frank chuckled. People are easier. Walter wasn't convinced. I'm not so sure. Later that afternoon, Karen Ellis met Daniel at his office. I brought the originals. She handed him a sealed envelope. Inside were printed emails, signed meeting notes, and financial projections. Daniel carefully organized each document. This is enough. Karen looked relieved. You think so? Daniel nodded. If anyone questions what happened. He closed the folder. The truth now has paperwork. Meanwhile, Mark finally did something he had avoided for years. He drove to a small church on the edge of town. Pastor Michael Sanders recognized him immediately. Mark. Pastor. It's been a while. Mark smiled awkwardly. Too long. The pastor nodded toward an empty pew. What brings you here? Mark looked around the quiet sanctuary. I've made a mess. Pastor Sanders smiled gently. Most people who walk through those doors have. Mark laughed weakly. I don't know how to fix it. The pastor waited. Finally, he said, sometimes the first thing you repair isn't the damage. What is it? The lie. Mark lowered his head. I've been lying to everyone. The pastor nodded. Then you know where to start. That evening, Walter sat with Sophie in the Sunrise Haven courtyard. She watched a butterfly land on a flower. Grandpa, yeah, can I ask you something? Always. If the ranch stays. Walter smiled. I hope it does. Will you teach me everything? He looked at her. What do you mean, thing? She smiled. How to read the weather. How to fix fences. How to care for horses. How Grandma made pecan pie. Walter laughed. I don't know if I can teach that last one. You know the recipe. No, then you'll teach me. Walter looked at his granddaughter for a long moment. He saw curiosity, kindness, responsibility. He also saw something he hadn't noticed before. Hope. I'd be honored. Sophie hugged him tightly. I want to earn it. Walter closed his eyes for a moment. Margaret. I think you were right. The next generation isn't always the one you expect. That night Brent Lawson gathered his senior staff. We're changing strategy. Neil Granger looked up. How? Brent placed several folders on the conference table. The festival. What about it? What control the narrative? Neil frowned. Walter speaking. Brent smiled. Only if people listen. The room grew quiet. One executive finally asked, what exactly are you suggesting? Brent looked around the table. I want every newspaper focused on economic growth. He slid out another folder. I want every investor standing behind David. Another folder. And I want cameras pointed at the development plans. Neil slowly understood. You want Walter's speech overshadowed. Brent smiled. Exactly. He stood. People believe what they see. Then he looked at the giant rendering of the subdivision hanging on the wall. So we'll give them something bigger to look at. Miles away, Walter was sitting alone in his room. Margaret's journal rested beside him. Next to it lay the certified property deed, and beneath both, the evidence Karen Ellis had risked everything to deliver. Walter carefully stacked the papers, then placed his weathered hand on top of them. He wasn't preparing for a fight anymore. He was preparing for the truth, and in 3 days, the entire county was going to hear it. The morning of the Heritage Festival arrived clear and cool. Walter had always believed the weather could set the mood for a day. Storm clouds warned people to prepare. Bright sunshine invited hope. Today's sky offered both. A cool breeze carried the smell of fresh, cut hay across Bennett Ranch. It smelled exactly the way it had 50 years ago. Some things, Walter thought, deserved to stay the same. By 7 o'clock, volunteers were already setting up booths. Local farmers unloaded fresh vegetables. Children chased each other between picnic tables. The church choir rehearsed beside the old red barn. The Bennett Ranch Heritage Festival had always been about community. That was why Walter and Margaret started it. Not to celebrate a ranch, to celebrate the people who helped build it. Walter's pickup rolled slowly through the front gate. Ryan was driving. Sophie sat between them. Emily followed in her own car after accepting Laura Jenkins' invitation to attend. Daniel arrived a few minutes later carrying a leather briefcase. Inside were the original property, deed, Karen Ellis documents, and enough evidence to silence anyone who questioned the truth. Walter stepped out of the truck. For the first time in weeks, he was home. He reached down and picked up a handful of dirt, just as Margaret had done decades earlier. He smiled. "Still looks after us." Ryan heard him. He didn't say a word. He simply smiled. David stood near the stage with Brent Lawson. Reporters were already arriving. Television cameras were being positioned. Everything looked exactly as Brent had planned. Except David. He wasn't smiling. Brent noticed immediately. "You don't look excited." David answered calmly. "I've been thinking." Brent adjusted his tie. "Thinking is overrated." David looked toward his father walking across the field. "I disagree." Brent followed his gaze. Walter stopped every few steps to shake hands with old friends, former ranch workers, teachers, veterans, young families. Everyone seemed genuinely happy to see him. Brent frowned. "He's popular." David answered quietly. "He earned that." Laura Jenkins stepped onto the stage. She tapped the microphone. "Good morning, everyone." The conversations gradually faded. "We'd like to welcome you to the 35th Annual Bennett Ranch Heritage Festival." Applause filled the field. Laura smiled. "This festival exists because 2 people believed a community grows stronger when neighbors know one another." She looked toward Walter. "Please join me in welcoming Mr. Walter Bennett." The applause grew louder, much louder. Walter slowly walked onto the stage. He looked out across hundreds of familiar faces. Some had grown older with him. Some had been children the last time he'd seen them. Others had never met him, but they all stood together on the same land. Walter adjusted the microphone. "I've never liked giving speeches." Laughter rippled through the crowd. "I've always preferred conversations." More laughter. "So let's just have one." He looked toward the old barn. "When Margaret and I started this festival," he smiled, "we only had 6 folding tables." People laughed again. "And one coffee pot." Frank shouted from the audience. "It wasn't very good coffee." The crowd laughed louder. Walter pointed toward him. "It still isn't." Even Frank laughed. The tension eased. Walter continued. "We never imagined hundreds of people would gather here every year." He paused. "But that's the wonderful thing about planting something good." He looked across the crowd. "You never really know how far it'll grow." Behind the stage, Brent checked his watch. "This is taking too long." Neil nodded. "He'll finish soon." Brent wasn't convinced. He signaled toward the production crew. One technician quietly walked toward the sound equipment. Walter continued speaking. "My father taught me that land isn't measured in acres." He looked toward Sophie. "It's measured in memories." He pointed toward the farmhouse. "First steps." Toward the barn. "First jobs." Toward the pasture. "First lessons." He smiled. "And sometimes see." He looked toward Ryan. "First mistakes." The crowd chuckled. Ryan smiled, remembering the stock pond. Walter's expression softened. "Everything worth keeping." He paused. "Takes time." Suddenly, the microphone crackled, then went silent. People looked around in confusion. The speakers stopped working. A murmur spread through the crowd. Laura frowned. The technician shrugged dramatically as if surprised. Daniel looked toward the sound booth. Something felt wrong. Emily noticed Brent watching the stage, not with concern, with satisfaction. Walter gently stepped away from the microphone. He looked across the audience, then smiled. Before microphones, farmers simply raised their voices. Walter took a deep breath. I guess we'll do this the old-fashioned way. The crowd laughed, then became completely silent. Walter's voice carried farther than anyone expected. Years of calling cattle across open fields had trained him well. I said. He smiled. Everything worth keeping takes time. People near the back repeated his words for those even farther away. Soon, the entire audience was helping. One sentence at a time, Walter spoke. The community echoed. Emily felt tears forming. It wasn't planned. It wasn't polished. It was beautiful. Brent stared in disbelief. Why isn't anyone leaving? Neil quietly answered, they're listening. Brent looked around. No one cared about the broken microphone anymore. Every eye remained fixed on Walter. For the first time, Brent realized he had badly underestimated something. Community. Walter finally reached the heart of his speech. This ranch has survived droughts. The crowd echoed. Droughts. It survived floods. It survived hard winters. He looked directly at his sons. But the hardest thing any family survives, a pause, is forgetting who they are. Silence settled over the field. Walter didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The Bennett Ranch doesn't belong to me. Ryan looked up. It never belonged to my father. Mark swallowed hard. It won't belong to my children. David lowered his head. Walter smiled gently. We're simply borrowing it. He looked across the entire crowd, until it's someone else's turn to protect it. The audience erupted into applause. Even before he had finished speaking, Walter stepped back from the edge of the stage. He wasn't finished, not even close. But he had reminded everyone why the ranch mattered. And now, it was time for the truth. As the applause slowly faded, Laura returned to the microphone. The sound system suddenly worked again. She looked puzzled. So that's interesting. A few people laughed. Walter smiled knowingly. Daniel leaned toward him. Ready? Walter looked at the leather briefcase containing the deed and Brent's internal emails. Then toward David, who was no longer standing beside Brent. Instead, David slowly walked toward the stage. Alone, and every person in the crowd turned to watch. David climbed the steps to the stage slowly. Each footstep felt heavier than the last. The applause had faded. Now the entire festival stood in complete silence. Brent Lawson remained near the media tent. His confident smile was gone. He watched David carefully, waiting, expecting, demanding. David stopped beside his father. For a moment, neither man spoke. Walter finally broke the silence. Are you all right? David looked at him. No. Walter nodded gently. That's a good place to start. Laura stepped aside from the microphone. She wasn't sure what was happening. Neither was anyone else. Daniel quietly placed his leather briefcase on a nearby table. Emily stood with Sophie and Ryan near the front of the crowd. Mark folded his arms tightly across his chest. He looked nervous, hopeful, ashamed. All at once, David looked out over the hundreds of familiar faces. Teachers, neighbors, former classmates, families who had attended this festival every year. People who had trusted the Bennett name. He took a deep breath. I was supposed to give a different speech today. The crowd waited. I was supposed to tell you about a new future. He glanced toward Brent. But before anyone can talk about the future, he looked back at Walter. They need to tell the truth about the present. Brent immediately started toward the stage. Neil Granger grabbed his arm. Don't. Brent pulled free. This isn't what we agreed. Neil lowered his voice. If you interrupt now. Brent stopped. Every camera was already pointed toward the stage. He forced himself to stay where he was. For the moment, David's hands trembled. I convinced my brothers that selling the ranch was the right decision. He swallowed. I convinced myself. A long silence followed. I believed promises that should never have been believed. He looked directly at Walter. I lied to my father. Then to Ryan. I lied to my family. Then to the crowd. And I lied to all of you. No one spoke. The honesty itself held everyone still. Walter quietly rested a hand on David's shoulder. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rescue him. Some truths had to be spoken by the person who owned them. David continued. I told everyone parts of the ranch would be preserved. His voice cracked. I was wrong. Daniel opened his briefcase. Walter nodded. It's time. Daniel removed several folders, original emails, corporate documents, financial projections, Karen Ellis evidence. He placed them on the podium. Walter addressed the audience. These documents were provided by a former employee of Lawson Development. He looked toward Karen, who stood quietly near the back of the crowd. She gave a small nod. They show plans that none of my sons were ever meant to see. Daniel held up the first enlarged document. The words were visible even from the front rows. Ready emo vlex de gestr cars a mndialti murmur spread through the audience. He held up another. Shartiachi farmanchio says no coam rcl veilivers another wave of whispers, then another. Yechi historical sedesigi deveriki is chiel be dienti emoti sqmp to that this time people didn't whisper, they gasped. Laura stepped toward Daniel. May I? Daniel handed her the documents. As president of the Historical Society, her opinion carried enormous weight. She read each page carefully, then looked toward Brent. Is this authentic? Brent answered quickly. Those are internal planning drafts. Daniel spoke calmly. They were obtained directly from Lawson Development. Brent smiled tightly. They're being taken out of context. Karen Ellis finally stepped forward. No. Every head turned. I worked there. Brent's expression changed instantly. Karen. She ignored him. I attended the meetings. She looked at the crowd. They never intended to preserve the farmhouse. She pointed toward the old red barn, or the barn. Then toward the orchard, or the orchard. She took a slow breath. The demolition schedule had already been approved. The crowd erupted into angry conversation. Reporters immediately surrounded Daniel. Can we see the documents? Are these public records? Were investors aware? Daniel answered evenly. They will be. He handed certified copies to the press. One by one, every camera zoomed in on the evidence. Brent realized there was no stopping it now. Mark slowly walked onto the stage. He stopped beside David. I need to say something too. Walter nodded. Mark faced the crowd. I helped keep this secret. He lowered his head. I told myself I was protecting my family. He looked toward Walter. The truth is, I was protecting myself. He took a deep breath. Sorry, the apology wasn't dramatic. It wasn't polished. It was simply honest. Walter saw several longtime neighbors quietly nod. People respected accountability. Ryan joined his brothers. For the first time in years, the three Bennett sons stood together, not against their father, beside him. Ryan looked at the audience. I almost let fear cost us everything. He smiled sadly. My father spent his whole life teaching us to fix broken fences. He glanced at David. We forgot he meant more than wood. David closed his eyes. Those words struck harder than any accusation. Brent could wait no longer. He strode toward the stage. This presentation is defamatory. Daniel stepped in front of him. Be careful, Mr. Lawson. Brent pointed toward the documents. They're confidential. Daniel smiled. Not anymore. Brent looked at Walter. You've destroyed a legitimate business opportunity. Walter answered quietly. No. I stopped one. Brent's voice grew sharper. You have no idea what this will cost. Walter smiled. I know exactly what selling the ranch would have cost. The crowd applauded. Louder this time. Not for Walter. For what he represented. Laura stepped back to the microphone. I believe the Historical Society has something to say. The board members quietly gathered beside her. She looked at the audience. Effective immediately. She paused. The Historical Society is submitting an emergency request to designate the Bennett Ranch, its farmhouse, barn, cemetery, and festival grounds as protected historical landmarks. For a heartbeat. No one reacted. Then the entire field exploded into applause. People rose to their feet. Neighbors hugged one another. Former ranch workers wiped tears from their eyes. Frank stood on his folding chair shouting, "About time." Even George couldn't stop laughing. Brent looked around. Investors who had arrived expecting a celebration were quietly leaving. Several avoided eye contact entirely. Others spoke with reporters instead. His phone began vibrating. Then again, he didn't need to answer. He already knew who was calling. Walter looked toward the farmhouse. Margaret's white rocking chair still sat on the front porch, waiting. Just as she had left it, he smiled softly. We're almost home. Daniel closed the final folder. The legal battle isn't over. Walter nodded. I know. Daniel smiled. But today, he looked across the cheering crowd. You already won the most important part. Walter looked at his three sons standing beside him. For the first time in many years, they weren't divided by money, or fear, or pride. They were simply family. And as the applause echoed across the pastures toward, a sheriff's patrol car slowly turned through the front gate, not with flashing lights, not in a hurry, but with a purpose. Sheriff Tom Henderson stepped out carrying an official envelope addressed to Brent Lawson. Whatever was inside, it was about to make Brent's worst day even worse. Sheriff Tom Henderson adjusted his hat as he walked toward the stage. The applause slowly faded. People stepped aside to let him pass. Walter recognized him immediately. Tom. The sheriff smiled. Walter. They had known each other for over 40 years. Tom had attended every heritage festival since the first one. He wished this visit were under different circumstances. Brent Lawson watched the sheriff approach. His stomach tightened. The official envelope bore the county seal. Tom stopped a few feet away. "Mr. Lawson." Brent forced a smile. "Yes. I've been asked to deliver these documents." He handed over the envelope. Brent opened it quickly. The smile disappeared almost instantly. Daniel recognized the first page, so they moved fast. Walter looked over. "What is it?" Daniel smiled. "The county has issued an emergency temporary preservation order." Laura Jenkins nodded proudly. "The Historical Society filed it an hour ago." Daniel continued. "Until the review is complete." He looked directly at Brent. "No demolition, land clearing, or structural changes can legally take place." A wave of applause spread across the crowd. Brent stared at the papers. "This is ridiculous." Sheriff Henderson answered calmly. "My job isn't to debate it." He tipped his hat. "My job is simply to enforce it." Brent folded the order carefully. "This is an Daniel nodded. "I agree." Brent looked at Walter. "You'll regret this." Walter smiled gently. "I've regretted enough things." He glanced toward his sons. "This won't be one of them." The reporters sensed the story growing even larger. Questions flew from every direction. "Mr. Bennett, what happens next? Will you sue Lawson Development? Did your sons know about the demolition plans?" Walter raised a hand. The crowd became quiet again. "My sons made mistakes." He looked toward David, Mark, and Ryan. "So did I." The reporters looked surprised. Walter continued. "I spent too much time believing they already knew what mattered." He smiled sadly. "I should have reminded them more often." David lowered his head. "Dad." Walter gently shook his head. "No." He looked back at the reporters. "If you're writing today's story," he paused, "don't make it about villains." Several reporters stopped typing. "Make it about second chances." One reporter stepped forward. "Mr. Bennett, what is it?" "If the ranch is protected." She hesitated. "Who inherits it?" Walter smiled. "That's a fair question." He looked toward Sophie, who stood beside Emily. Sophie suddenly looked very nervous. Walter motioned for her to join him. She slowly climbed the stage. "Come here." She stood beside him. Walter rested a hand on her shoulder. "When I was younger," he looked across the audience, "I thought inheritance meant receiving property." He smiled. "I was wrong." He looked at Sophie. "Inheritance is receiving responsibility." She looked up at him. "I don't know if I'm ready." Walter chuckled. "Neither was I." The audience laughed softly. Walter continued. "One day," he looked toward his sons, "this ranch will belong to someone." He smiled at Sophie. "But not because their name is on a piece of paper." He looked back at the crowd. "It will belong to the person willing to protect it." Sophie squeezed his hand. She understood exactly what he meant. David stepped forward. "Dad," Walter turned. "I've been thinking." Walter smiled. "I can see that." David took a deep breath. "If you'll let me," he looked toward the crowd, "I'd like to resign." The audience looked confused. David continued. "I resign from every agreement with Lawson Development." He reached into his jacket, pulled out several folded contracts, then slowly tore them in half, one by one. The pieces drifted to the stage forward. Brent took a step forward. "You can't do that." David looked directly at him. "I just did." The crowd erupted into applause. Mark reached into his pocket. "I've got something too." He pulled out the keys to the ranch office. He handed them to Walter. "I stopped acting like a caretaker." His voice cracked. "I started acting like an owner." Walter gently closed Mark's fingers around the keys. "No." He smiled. "You started acting like a son again." Mark couldn't hold back his tears. Ryan looked around the stage. "It feels strange." Walter laughed. "What does?" "Standing beside you instead of against you." Walter smiled warmly. "I like this better." "So do I." The brothers shared the first genuine smile they'd shared together in years. Not forced, not polite, real. Karen Ellis quietly began walking away from the crowd. She had never wanted recognition, only peace. Walter noticed. "Karen." She turned. He walked down from the stage toward her. "You saved more than a ranch." Karen shook her head. "I just told the truth." Walter smiled. "That's usually how things get saved." He extended his hand. This time, the handshake happened. The crowd applauded once again. Not because it was dramatic, because it felt right. Emily stood watching from beneath the old oak tree. Laura walked over. "You care about him." Emily smiled. "I do." Laura nodded knowingly. "He's a remarkable man." Emily looked toward Walter, laughing with his sons. "Yes, he is." She paused. "I'm just glad he gets to go home." As the afternoon sun began to settle lower over the ranch, families gathered for the traditional community picnic. Children played tag near the creek. The church choir sang old hymns beneath the barn. Neighbors shared homemade pies and lemonade. For the first time all day, Walter wasn't answering questions. He wasn't defending anything. He simply sat on the farmhouse porch, exactly where he had told Emily he wanted to be. A plate of Margaret's pecan pie rested beside him. Sophie had made it using her grandmother's recipe. It wasn't perfect. The crust was slightly uneven. Walter smiled after the first bite. It tastes exactly right. Sophie laughed. It does. Walter nodded. Because it was made with love. She hugged him. As evening approached, Daniel walked onto the porch carrying one final envelope. What now? Walter asked. Daniel handed it over. It arrived from the county clerk. Walter opened it carefully. Inside was confirmation that the original deed remained exactly as Margaret intended. Walter Bennett remained the sole legal owner of the ranch. Attached was a handwritten note from the clerk. Sometimes paperwork protects more than property. Walter folded the note carefully and slipped it into Margaret's journal. He looked across the pastures glowing beneath the golden sunset. We're almost finished. Daniel smiled. I know. Walter looked toward his family laughing together in the yard. No. He shook his head gently. I think. He smiled. We're finally beginning. The old dinner bell hanging beside the barn suddenly rang across the ranch. The same bell Walter's father had rung every evening for supper. Without anyone asking, children, parents, neighbors, and the entire Bennett family began walking toward the farmhouse together. Just as they always had. Just as they should have. Walter watched them with tears quietly filling his eyes. Home wasn't a building. It was the people walking toward it. Tomorrow, he would make one final decision. A decision that would shape the future of Bennett Ranch for generations. The next morning dawned quietly over Bennett Ranch. The festival tents were coming down. The last of the visitors had gone home. Only the sound of birds and the gentle breeze remained. Walter stood on the farmhouse porch with a cup of coffee in his hands, for the first time in weeks. There were no meetings, no lawyers, no developers, no arguments, just home. He looked toward the empty rocking chair beside him. Margaret's chair. He smiled. We did it. The breeze stirred the wildflowers along the fence line. It almost felt like an answer. Inside the farmhouse, the smell of breakfast drifted through the kitchen. Sophie stood at the stove with Emily. Ryan was setting the table. Mark was washing dishes before anyone could ask. David carried a basket of fresh biscuits to the dining room. Walter watched through the screen door. Years ago, mornings like this had been ordinary. Now, they felt like miracles. Emily noticed him standing outside. You coming in? Walter laughed. I didn't want to interrupt. Ryan smiled. Dad, you built this table. David added quietly, you should probably sit at the head of it. Walter stepped inside. No. He looked around at everyone. I'd rather sit where I can see all of you. After breakfast, Daniel arrived carrying one final folder. I think this is the last piece. Walter smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. They gathered around the dining room table. Daniel opened the folder. I've prepared a new estate plan. The room became quiet. Walter looked at his sons. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what comes next. No one interrupted. I've decided the ranch will never be divided into smaller pieces. Ryan nodded. Mark understood why. David simply listened. Walter continued. The land stays together. He looked at Sophie. And it stays with the family. Sophie looked startled. Grandpa? Walter smiled. I'm not giving it to one person. Everyone looked confused. Daniel slid a document across the table. Walter explained. The ranch will be placed into the Bennett Family Stewardship Trust. Ryan frowned thoughtfully. What does that mean? It means no one can sell it for personal profit. Daniel continued the explanation. Future generations can live here. They can work here. They can manage it. They must protect it. Walter nodded. The land belongs to every generation. He smiled. We're only its caretakers. Sophie looked at the papers. So nobody can ever do this again. Walter answered softly. That's the idea. David slowly stood. Dad, Walter looked at him. I don't deserve another chance. Walter didn't answer immediately. Finally he said, no. David lowered his eyes. I know. Walter smiled gently. You deserve the opportunity to earn one. David looked up. Walter continued. Trust isn't given. It's grown, just like crops. David nodded, tears filling his eyes. I'll spend the rest of my life earning it. Walter reached across the table. I believe you will. The father and son shook hands. Then, without another word, they embraced, not because the past had disappeared, but because they had chosen not to let it define the future. Mark walked outside with Walter later that afternoon. They stopped beside the old red barn. I've been thinking. Walter smiled. That seems to be contagious. Mark laughed. I sold my boat. Walter looked surprised. You loved that boat. I did. What changed? Mark looked toward the family cemetery. I've got debts. Walter nodded. I'm paying them myself. Walter placed a hand on his shoulder. That's something your grandfather would have respected. Ryan found Sophie repairing a loose fence board. You know Grandpa would have fixed that tomorrow. Sophie shrugged. I saw it today. Ryan smiled. I think he would have liked that answer. She looked across the pasture. Do you think we'll really keep this place forever? Ryan looked at the rolling hills. I don't know about forever. He smiled. But I know we'll give the next generation the chance. A week later, the county commissioners gathered to vote. The courtroom was full. Neighbors, former ranch workers, teachers, veterans, members of the Historical Society, even people who had never attended a meeting before. Laura Jenkins stood first. She spoke about history. Pastor Sanders spoke about community. Karen Ellis spoke about integrity. Finally, Walter walked to the podium. He didn't bring notes. He didn't need them. He looked at the commissioners. I've spent my whole life raising cattle. A few smiles appeared. I never imagined I'd spend retirement protecting paperwork. The soft laughter filled the room. Walter's smile faded into quiet sincerity. This ranch isn't valuable because of what's built on it. He paused. It's valuable because of what was built inside the people who grew up there. Silence settled across the room. The lessons, the memories, the responsibility, you can't replace those with concrete. When he finished, no one applauded. Not because they disagreed. Because everyone understood. An hour later, the vote was unanimous. Bennett Ranch, its farmhouse, its barn, its family cemetery, and the Heritage Festival grounds were officially designated protected historical landmarks. Walter closed his eyes for a brief moment. Margaret would have loved that. Months passed. The ranch slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm. Children visited during school field trips. The Heritage Festival became larger than ever. Sophie learned to mend fences, ride horses, and bake pecan pie almost as well as her grandmother. David rebuilt trust one day at a time. Mark became the volunteer treasurer for the Historical Society, determined never to mishandle money again. Ryan managed the daily work of the ranch with quiet pride. Emily accepted a new position at Sunrise Haven, but every Sunday afternoon, she drove out to the ranch for dinner. She always claimed she came for Sophie's pie. No one believed her, least of all Walter. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Walter sat once again on the farmhouse porch. Emily joined him with 2 cups of coffee. Still your favorite seat? Walter smiled. It always will be. They watched Sophie laughing with her father near the barn. The dinner bell rang. Voices echoed across the yard. Home. Walter looked toward Margaret's rocking chair. The breeze gently moved it back and forth. He smiled. Looks like we're keeping our promise. The chair rocked once more, then became still. Walter looked out across the ranch one last time. The fences stood straight. The barn stood proud. The farmhouse windows glowed with warm light. And the Bennett Ranch was exactly where it had always belonged. Home. Before this story comes to an end, I'd love to hear from you. If you were at Walter's place, would you have forgiven your children after everything that happened? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read as many as I can. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep bringing heartfelt stories like this one to life. Until next time, take care of the people you love. Because sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't land or money. It's the family that chooses to come home.